All right, hello, everyone. Welcome back. Oh, hey, nice to see a new person in chat. What's up, William V? Why am I debating about Hunter? I don't think that's exactly what I'm saying. If I remember correctly, my title should be debate review about Hunter. But if you're curious what the subject is, this is a continuation from yesterday. We are watching Hunter Avallone debate Saanvi Reasoning on the subject of whether trans women are women. We're already about 45 minutes in, and I figured we need to pick it up because there's a lot to talk about, as we already did yesterday. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It is 4th of July, so happy America Day to anyone who cares about that. I figured, even though it is quite warm, I have the Boston Harbor tea, so I mean, if ever there was a day to drink Boston Harbor tea, it would be today, right? Um, to any of you who are happy about Fourth of July, happy Fourth of July. But we got this debate to get back into, so we can swap on over. All Hunter does is resort to insults and debates and try to prove his own points. So I have seen Hunter do this on occasion, but that is not my experience in this debate. In this debate, Hunter is making very good arguments. It's a bit of a struggle because I think Hunter is also not like particularly experienced with like this kind of opponent, this style of argumentation. In this case, he's making a very good effort. The biggest problem he's been having, and this will be a good time to recap, is that he has a very strange definition of of woman. I know it's an attempt at a solution to a problem, the problem of like anti-trans debaters trying to like taking weird approaches of like, well, no, circularity in a definition is never okay, even though like it's sometimes okay, or like so his definition is, I'm paraphrasing here, something to the effect of a woman is someone who identifies with the gender role in society that is associated with being more feminine, and with femininity, I guess, in a way. But that said, he seems to say that identifying as a woman is to sufficiently feminine to meet that criteria, though there seems to be a little bit of uncertainty when it comes to very butch women. I don't know. It's a little weird, but thankfully, I think we've moved past that point. And most recently, when we left off, Sanvi was presenting problems. She called them problems, but they weren't an issue really, right? Like the idea that infants would therefore not have a gender identity, which makes sense. Children don't really do gender at all, or infants at the very least, right? They're babies. They just do baby things. They don't really have like it'd be kind of weird to say like, that's a like he's being so boyish or so girlish. It's like is an infant. They're not really doing much of gender in any regard, and most of what they do is decided by their parents, right? If they dress a particular like, if an infant's in a dress, and it's not because they dressed themselves and they felt that was more appropriate, it's because their parents did. So that's more or less where we left off. So, William V, I haven't seen you around before. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. A few days ago, or I guess last week, we established it is a violation of my free speech rights if you don't like, comment, and subscribe. So, reminder to everybody. But let's get back into it.
These XYZ implications. Now you can say you're fine with those implications, but
So,
I
yeah,
think
she's
that
talking about the implications. The immediately prior to this, she was talking about infants being agender as being a natural consequence of Hunter's position, which, yeah, that's fine. Like that's not a problem. What's the issue with that? But now she's saying, okay, there's consequences to that type of position. Let's hear, Sanvi. What
the majority of
problems
people
are
would
there?
say
What
like
consequences are there?
we're not born a gender.
Well, people might say
Okay,
that, but
that's fine what
people
people
say all
might
sorts
say.
of things. People say
Okay,
lots of
yeah,
things that are
okay.
wrong.
That
People
was
can
just
say what they
kind of
want,
why.
but
That's
again,
kind of
it's
Pe-
why
like
I.
some people say that the Earth is flat. Congratulations, they're incorrect. I don't know what to tell you. Some people think birds exist. People are wrong constantly.
I was
this
asking
is the
that,
thing
not as a
is
gotcha. I was just trying to understand if that was something you were willing to
so I'm
like
gonna say
concede to.
what you
That's all.
said earlier
It's
is
not really a
just if
concession, right?
something is does just if my definition is not all encompassing and you can find a couple exceptions, doesn't mean that trans women are not are a woman is someone whose internal perception aligns with what we culturally use.
And a reminder here, and this is something Hunter's kind of pointing out, is as much as Sanvi wants to take the position of like, oh, I'm just saying you are wrong. Um, the two sides do each have their own proposed definitions here, right? Like she is a proponent of the biological essentialist view, and in this case, it's not like if Hunter doesn't prove his position, everybody walks away going, I guess there's we don't have a definition for women. It de facto supports her position because people wrongly think it's the normal and typical definition that we use for gender.
Use being feminine. It doesn't negate my definition. And if you're going to say that because when I bring up the fact that your definition is even less, serves even less utility, and is far less encompassing than mine, then
This is why
you're right that it
he's
doesn't
saying like he's
prove
comparing
trans
the
women to
definitions.
women.
This ought to be a discussion of which definition is the most workable, is the best for our purposes, but it's framed as only Hunter's definition is up for debate, and Sanvi's is not. This is a little bit of the format working to her advantage in a kind of dishonest way, not intentionally by the moderator, though the way she's hiding behind it feels a bit dishonest. It's like, yes, that's true. Technically, that's not you're not here to defend your position, but ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're actually discussing is one which we would either of us would have to support our case, and to assume that if and to act as though you don't have to support yours is pretty dishonest.
But it is a little bit ironic that you're arguing that position when the definition you're trying to defend is worse. It has all the problems.
I don't have the
problems you're
burden
trying
of
to
Yeah,
having
this is
an
exactly what she was saying.
all-encompassing
are worse for
definition.
you.
And he's right,
I never
and she's
accepted
like
that I would
technically
argue an
right,
encompassing
but
definition.
ultimately wrong, right? Because yeah, in a very technical, like in a very competitive debate sense, that is all she would be there to do. But in a competitive debate, you wouldn't have a topic like this, and this is a situation where like we're more. It's closer to having a discussion on the validity of trans identity than it is a like formalized debate. Because again, she's not going to walk away from this and go, well, since if Hunter didn't prove his position, then there is no definition for woman. She's only going to she's going to walk away from this thinking biologically essentialist views, which means yeah, you're if that's the default and you think that should be just like accepted, well, we can attack that should be attacked. It's reasonable for Hunter to attack that assumption.
Of trans woman you did of woman that would be trans inclusive. So that's why I think that if there are counter examples that are posed, you would at least agree that not all trans women are women, just most are.
Like another way Hunter could have reframed the argument is to say, I'm going to interpret this debate topic as um, is my definition for what a woman is, which happens to include trans women, the most workable definition, right? And if when you put it in the, like, oh, most workable, then it's like, well, you'd have to present something that works better than Hunter's, which I think there are, but certainly not hers.
At least.
Well,
I'm gonna try not to
I
go
would
on about
agree
it too
that
much, even though it's gonna
a
come up a
woman is
lot.
someone whose internal perception aligns with what we culture views being feminine. Again, the example you gave me was like this one time of someone who said their internal perception was masculine. I would love to talk to that person and see how that even works.
That doesn't seem that weird to me. It's surprised that Hunter finds it so strange. This is harkening back to another example that they had earlier in the debate. If we had watched it all the way through, it would have been more coherent, but we would have been here for like 6 hours. Where it was talking about like a very butch woman, very masculine presenting and masculine feeling woman, which doesn't seem that strange to me, but Hunter finds as a very odd concept, at the very least, that they would also identify as being very masculine, but also a woman. That doesn't sound odd at all, but Apparently, it does to Hunter.
There makes sense. And like I know you mentioned the tomboy counterexample and how that doesn't really hold. And I think that it does because if your internal perception is every thought, every desire, every preference is more so geared towards what we culturally view as masculine rather than feminine, right? Then they would in turn be a man to you. And maybe we
Yeah.
can't be inclusive of every single thing, but we can say most. If most of your internal perceptions align with masculinity,
Oh,
then
right, but
you
now
have to
now
be a
you
man
have
by
a
your
lot of
logic.
like now you're trying to do like soul math, like what percentage of your internal perception is masculine versus well, I got a 63.2% masculine internal sense, so I'm definitely a man, but well, this other person they're like 50.3, if it swings like that's just like not how that's just not how people work. It's a very like weirdly rigid view.
You have a internal perception that aligns with
I agree,
cultural views
Amazon
of
came.
masculinity, yeah, you'd be a man.
No.
That's my
Yeah,
definition.
Wait.
And
and I
at
think
least
that
just
that
to
I'm not
back
sure
up
what
a
you're
little
saying.
bit here,
still
in the
works.
context of this conversation, you do have a bit of a burden here to defend the current definition
The
because
masculinity BuzzFeed quiz.
that's the definition.
Why?
That's the current definition. Because if we don't accept my definition, we go back to the current definition.
I wouldn't bite that bullet because I do think it's like the current definition's a little bit of a myth, but he's got a point of like you're by taking the stance of mere negation, you can just assume like you can assume that yours is preferable by being the status quo. Like, it's just the way things are, so we can just go back to that. But if that's a problem, if that's not workable, then we have to ask what is a better solution. And so that's why it's relevant here, even though technically we're not talking. This is one where like the way this debate is framed is a real problem.
And
No,
if
so
you're going
what
to
we
say
do is if we
you
don't
recognize that
know
you're
what
saying here's a
something
flaw
is,
with
we
your
remain
definition, let's go
agnostic
back to the one
or
that has all
unconvinced.
these
You
flaws
you
in it
say that,
instead,
but you're definitely not going to be
conclusively.
agnostic. You're out
If
here with PowerPoint presentations about why trans women aren't women. You're not going to be agnostic about it. Why are you lying about this? Like, well, I know why, but like, do you think that's like again, it's hiding behind the format, but it's so obviously not true that she's going to remain agnostic about it, or that people will remain agnostic. Obviously, if Hunter doesn't make the case for his definition, people will default towards a very exclusionary and like not workable definition used by gender essentialists.
if we don't accept something, we just remain
And this is why it's
agnostic or
important to
unconvinced
dispel the
on it, right?
myth
So say you're
that
not
it's the
convinced of
the
my
normal view.
definition, I'm not convinced of yours, so we would be agnostic on the proposition are trans women women, right? We wouldn't take a position either way if there's no clear understanding here. So
Then
that's
what
why
is
You wouldn't take a position, but you do,
so
right?
then what is your definition of a woman?
my definition of a woman would be a female, adult human female.
Oh, so you're not remaining agnostic? Wild.
Okay, so okay. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I just
Yeah, I don't think.
understand
Yeah,
that it does.
I haven't seen Hunter do a lot of this kind of debating, but he does seem more over his head than Vosh was in a similar position. It's not easy, to be fair. Like, it seems it's one of those like I'm comfortable with it because I spent years doing competitive debate and I'm used to this. But like, if you're not, it's really hard to go from like even being good at argumentation, which I'm not sure how good Hunter is at argumentation. I haven't seen a lot of his stuff, but even if you are good at it, this kind of debate can be hard to just fall into. You kind of need to know what you're doing, and it sucks because they're not actually more correct or more honest or more or have better arguments. They just couch themselves in the appearance of this. It's certainly I've something I've seen a lot doing competitive debate, and why I think that, and if I'm honest, now for all of you here, you can see me open my heart. Part of why I wanted to make this channel because I see things like this happen, and I see kind of a rift in the left of people not particularly accustomed to arguing in this way, and we can do better. So I'll hope to help people do better. Hopefully, I can do better. We'll see how things go.
Doesn't mean that my claim is true, but it also is like that your definition has the same problems you're trying to bring up about my definition, but your definition has them worse.
But I never accepted a burden to make an inclusive
No, you didn't
definition of trans
accept
people.
a
You did.
burden, but
You want an inclusive
you didn't
definition
accept a burden, but you obviously have a position, right?
of women on biology, right?
Hence why we're debating are trans women women, because you're assuming you're
Wait,
taking.
no. I want to ask you this question here.
This is
You
not a
want
bad
your
line, but it's
definition,
going to be
an
very
adult
difficult.
human female, to be as encompassing as possible of women in the basis of biology, right? Of the biological characteristics.
And now he can come back to what he was talking about in his opening, which just a reminder to everybody, he did go on kind of at length of how unworkable the idea of adult human female as a definition is. There are so many people that don't get included in that definition, but we would recognize as women, and not like, oh, just because we're being nice or whatever. Like, they would be cisgender women, not trans women, and we're just like playing along, which some people think is what's going on with trans people. But cisgender women would be left out of that definition, and so now we can come back to this, which is fine, and it's good to approach this. It's just going to be very difficult to get her to actually defend a position.
Collection of biological characteristics to make.
I don't want it to be anything. Just how it functionally works is how it's going to work.
So the goal
I
of
don't
a
have
definition.
any
So then maybe
type
I
of
should
desire to have an inclusive definition.
Well, we know that.
So then
We
maybe I
know
should
you're not
rephrase
trying to be
The
inclusive.
goal.
Oh,
of
you mean for cis
definitions,
women?
The
Never
reason
mind.
they exist is to try and be as encompassing as possible.
No, it's to describe concepts.
It's to describe concepts that
Both those are not contradictory statements. What? Okay, now we're gonna get into what a definition is.
be as encompassing of those concepts as
like,
possible.
for example,
No,
like,
it's just
When
what
we're
is it-
talking about,
what do you
at least
think
if we're
that-
talking about something like, hold on, if we're talking about something as the definition of, yes, a woman or female, we want the definition to include as many people who are female and exclude as many people who are not female as possible.
this is from someone who's so wrapped up in I'm talking about Saanvi here, who's so wrapped up in the necessity that a definition be as clear as possible, so that like we can read a dictionary and understand what the word means, even though that's not how anyone gains an understanding of what a woman is, that she'll like reject any circularity in definition, any ambiguity. It has to be like super clear, and if you leave out one trans person, then you failed and whatever. Like, she's this specific and strict about it, but she feels no need for her definition to even include all people she would consider cis women. This is the kind of dishonesty I was talking about. It presents By presenting in this way, it seems like she's being just like, it's just academic and philosophical rigor. It's just being logical and going with the facts lead us, what arguments can we weigh? But it's not that at all. She's willing to make huge exceptions for her own position, which she wants to get away with not defending by hiding behind the format, but require to the person specificity in the definitions proposed by her opponent. Just want that dishonesty is like, it's really important to be aware of.
Well,
And
that would
your
just be
definition
evident, right?
excludes
Like
females.
when we look at what a triangle is, like, what is a triangle, Hunter?
And she'll go back to definitions of things that are like very
Shape.
easy to define, very clear, but also well, you can get to weird stuff with polygon with triangles.
Like anything beyond that, because a triangle is distinct from a rectangular.
But like, obviously,
Go ahead.
defining a social category is very different than defining a mathematical concept. In actuality, there are no triangles in the world, right? We consider the concept and then draw approximations, because there are issues of like, well, is this a straight line? It's not a series of points. It has a width or whatever. Like, there are lots of these, like, lots of things where you can make it clear that this doesn't exist in the world. Not that that's super important, but as opposed to like a social category, even female, a biological concept doesn't have distinct lines around it. But by equating the two with equating that with something that is so rigidly defined with like mathematical precision and is an abstract concept, she can imply a similar level of rigor is appropriate but like her definition doesn't work that way. The only reason why it's not a problem for her is she's insistent on not defending it.
Just go ahead and make your point.
Like a, three-sided, three-angled, two-dimensional shape, right? So if we take something like that, and then somebody posits a counterexample like,
Hold on, let me see if I can find, because I was like, there are issues. Is this a triangle? Right? Like, this is what I mean about the ambiguity of definition and, like, why absurd specificity is such a problem. We would probably call this a triangle. Well, who you asked, actually, might vary, especially if you ask, like, a mathematician. But it doesn't have three angles. It has three curves. And so it doesn't, like, meet the specific definition, but we would call it a triangle. But also, it meets her definition because she didn't oh, no, she said three angled. Like, is this an angle? Well, who knows? Oh, is it these aren't lines, right? They have a width. Lines are a series of points with no width. It's a single. It's one dimensional. But like this is what I mean. Like when you get way too deep into the specificity of definitions, they start to lose meaning, and that's what she's attempting to do with the concept of woman and forced Hunter into a position of. And by not defending her position, she gets away from not doing it herself,
oh, what
or
about
gets away from
obtuse
those problems
triangle? I'll
herself.
say those are included. And then if somebody says, what about a square? I can say, so sorry, that's not included, right? So I have no desire for definitions to be inclusive rather than them just be functional in describing things.
Oh, well, functional is very different, but that hasn't been the barometer you've been using at any point. Beauty standards change, scientific understanding changes, often if refuse to adapt and understand. Yeah, yeah. But also, like, what did she just say? Hold
Desire
on.
for definitions to be inclusive rather than them just be functional and
But it just be functional. Well, consider if you can include women or trans women as women, that is very functional. It operates very well, actually. But obviously, that's not the standard that she's holding Hunter to, right? She's holding him to ultimate specificity. To if I can find one hypothetical example of a trans person that wouldn't be included, then your definition fails. Even though she's happy with definitions not being that specific anywhere else.
describing things.
Okay, so you want them to be functional in describing things.
Yeah.
So your definition fails in functionality.
Oh, and by the way, the definition of a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman is very functional. Like there is no question that functions exceptionally well. In fact, her objection to that definition is not functionality, it's circularity. But and like, oh, we can't read the definition and have a complete understanding. But she's already admitted that we couldn't read her definition and have a complete understanding. So clearly that's not a standard that we hold all definitions to.
Mine doesn't. So I'm not even talking about, you have to understand here is my argument here doesn't even need to be trans women are women because of my definition, etc. My definition accounts for people that you currently view as women more so than your definition. Your definition doesn't serve that functionality.
I would disagree with that because, for example, I view a newborn infant as a girl, and I view an adult human female who has a severe cognitive disability as a woman. Yet you would say both of those individuals are in fact a gender.
And the only problem with that, first of all, no, he wouldn't. The second person she described, you could just go, well, they've already demonstrated that, like, they've already identified as a woman, and so we can just like continue with that and treat them as such, even if like in a metaphysical sense they're agender. But that's also not a problem, right? She's presenting it as though it's an issue, but that's only an issue if you assume that she's already correct in what she says. But why would we assume that? It's often a fight to get mainstream understanding of a new concept like trans people, or changed understanding like what it means to be healthy. Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And I mean that's why it's really unfortunate that these kinds of debates are necessary. I tend to agree with people who say like, well, trans, like it's kind of sucks for trans people that their civil rights are up for debate, and it does. They really shouldn't be up for debate, but sadly they are, and the way we get them to not be is by going through this fight, and it really sucks that that's where we have to be, but that's where we have to be, unfortunately. I was gonna say there's nothing we can do about that, but the thing we can do about that is what we're doing, and sadly means that these debates kind of have to happen. And I'm sorry, it sucks.
Not women.
That's just having a better understanding of the concept of gender. This doesn't actually help your point at all. How does your definition serve functionality?
Take
Hold on, wait,
something like,
please. How does your definition serve functionality if it
in what I'm trying
isn't
to
as
say.
encompassing?
It serves functionality in what I'm trying to say. So, like, if we were to take a gender non-conforming radical feminist, like, do you know what that kind of is in the literature?
Go ahead, yes.
Yeah. So people who want to disassociate femininity and the social construct of femininity from females altogether. So intentionally, these people adopt more masculine things and have
Okay.
more masculine perceptions, yet they still consider themselves women. So I would.
Yeah, this is a problem of Hunter's definition exclusively, and it makes it difficult to review because I disagree with Hunter's definition because problems like this come up. I think his response to that, the kind of person described, I think his response to that is pretty effective. Like I think it makes sense, but there are other instances where it's less workable. However, if you use what is a very common view and one that I agree with, that a woman is someone who identifies as a woman, then you would have no problems with an individual as described, right? Like they identify as a woman, boom, they're a woman. Femininity is not a requisite for womanhood.
See how you would account for this.
Oh, and by the way, like that kind of idea that femininity is a requisite for womanhood is a demonstration of why of Saanvi's definition is by no means the like normal and natural and traditional definition of womanhood, because clearly there was an association and a requisite beyond just being an adult human female, and people were calling very very masculine women not women despite the fact that they are, despite the fact that they're adult human females. That's not how we approach these things. It's just not.
You keep derailing and like just moving to a different thing and not answering the question I'm asking.
No, like because
you
the
said
claim that you made was
you
that
said the goal of a definition is to serve functionality, and I'm asking
in describing.
By the way,
things,
functionality is like is interchangeable here with utility. So it's weird that she's taking a position that would be. It's only because it's Hunter that she can do this. If she was debating, for example, Fosh, she didn't do this and she couldn't get away with this because when you start talking about utility, she's clearly wrong. Clearly, her definition functions significantly less well than the self ID view. But she doesn't want to argue about that. And then she just wants to argue about circularity.
Yes,
in describing that's what I said.
In describing concepts.
Yeah.
So if you want to serve functionality in describing a concept as a woman being an adult human female, but yet your definition doesn't serve that functionality because there are millions of people that you would recognize as being women.
And he laid out who these millions are, by the way.
Even
in his opening
would be excluded from your definition.
To his credit, he did foresee that was relevant and like came with the information he would need. Sorry, let's back it up.
Who would be excluded from your definition?
No, because they would still be females because chromosomes don't determine that. But I feel like this is.
But what does, right? Like that now you get to, okay, chromosomes don't determine sex. Cool, I agree. What does then? Where are those lines? He proposed a bunch of different things, by the way, that aren't just chromosomes. Things like, well, is it like the ability to give birth, or is it the genitalia, or is it like being of the category that could give birth but doesn't necessarily have to be able to in this instance, or is it like large gamete producers? There's a lot of groups that don't get covered by this definition, and like being held to task about it, it would be impossible for her to defend her definition. But obviously she's trying as hard as possible not to have to. It's easy to stay in your comfort zone of what you know, especially if you're invested lots of time understanding the world a certain way, make your living using them previously understand. Yeah, it's true. People are afraid of change. People don't like to admit they're wrong. People are afraid of things they don't understand. Yeah. I mean, all of that's true for sure. It's one of those things like someone starts arguing enough against trans identity, and you start to ask yourself like, why? Like, what is your specific beef with this? Because for what it just seems like it's never like a position they just hold, and they've come to this conclusion of. It's always motivated. J.K. Rowling is a great example of like she had like the primary reason she cites for her trans bigotry is that she was like sexually assaulted in the 90s by a man, and so now she hates like, and now she's like, like now she's like, well, therefore anyone who was born a man is a threat. Therefore, trans women are just like sneaking their way. It's like clearly trauma and a bigotry response to that trauma, but it's just like clearly you're not well, and it makes you wonder about people like this, especially when you have multiple PowerPoint presentations about why trans people aren't the gender with which they identify. Jay had lots of gender trauma. Yeah, she had a lot of stuff.
Relevant
So
to
chromosomes don't determine.
But maybe don't turn that into bigotry. That's I don't know. I'm so brave. Please hold your applause. I know. But yeah, maybe don't turn your trauma into bigotry.
Permanent then.
this
So
is
then
not
what-
relevant to the proposition are trans women women? Because
Well,
even if
it
I were
might
to
be
accept
depending
that,
on
like,
what collection of biological traits do you think
Whoa.
makes a woman a woman?
I actually do like that he's just like, no, I don't care that you think you don't have to defend yourself, and holding her to the fire. It's not great in terms of like what is reasonable to expect in this kind of debate, which is why sometimes you need someone who isn't trying to debate in this way to break the foundations here. But I do like that he's like, I don't care. We're putting you to the test now. We're putting your positions to the test.
I don't think this is relevant to our trans women, right?
It could
would
be
you,
because if trans
let me
women have
ask you
undergone
this.
sex
Would you
reassignment,
agree
for
that,
example.
would you agree, we might have different accounts of this, but would you at least agree that there are males and there are females?
As far as sexual characteristics, yeah.
Like that kind of question is a little weird, right? Because to say like there are males and there are females is one of those like in a way it's like, what do you mean by are? Like, do you mean like those are categories that we have created? Sure. Do you mean there's like an ontological concept of male that we can correctly identify people into the category of? I'm less certain. That's a way more dubious philosophical prospect, but obviously she's not attempting to defend it. She is just putting Hunter in a position where if he were to say no, it would be intuitively nonsense. But that said, while there are like, even if you want to go, yes, there are males and females as like ontological concepts. Uh, she hasn't yet, but will have to if she's going to be honest about the biology. Acknowledge that there are people who do not fit neatly into these categories. At a minimum, intersex people exist, but also there are the kinds of people that he has laid out of like, okay, but what are the like, where are the lines for these categories? There are people who lie outside of this that we would consider part of those categories.
Yes.
Like, yeah, sex wise, there is a biological.
Yes, we generally recognize two like
Okay.
archetypes. Yeah.
And by the
So,
way, it's
yeah.
in biology, it's those two sexes are bimodal, not binary.
So even with that being said, what makes a male be able to be a woman is the discussion, right? Because even if I
Now,
were to concede,
she just
sure,
wants to
let's
use it to
concede
like to get away from having to defend her
all of
position.
them aren't women, it would still have no bearing on if a trans woman is a woman.
I understand that, but the reason I'm asking you about your view of what collection of biological traits would suffice to be a woman is because it could, if we're talking about, say, a trans person who's undergone sex reassignment. So if you're saying, well, for me,
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah. You're
So for clarifying, in case anyone didn't see what he was saying, because I think they're on the same page, but they didn't fully flesh out the idea. To some people, it would be, you would say like, oh, it's your genitalia that determines your gender, and in fact, transphobes not very long ago were holding that line. But the problem is bottom surgery exists. So the problem for a transphobe, I mean. So if a trans person gets bottom surgery, have they changed their sex now? Right? Like if a trans woman has a vagina, now you have to admit she's a woman, she's female, right? But they don't want to do that, so they move they move the goalpost, right? They move it to, well, you have to be able to give birth, and then it became clear that, well, there's a huge number of women cannot give birth. Cis women, not even like not even on the fringes that we've discussed here, but like, you know, a 6-year-old girl can't give birth and a postmenopausal woman can't give birth. And, these are still women by anybody's definition. The most bigoted person's definition, they're still women. Well, I guess the most bigoted person might be like, well, nope, stop being a woman because you can't pump out kids. But those people tend not to really exist. So what he's getting at is like, when we need to know where these lines are. So like, we can even talk about so we can talk about what fits these categories. We need to know where the lines are between sex to determine where people land. I have heard argument, and I mentioned this yesterday, that uh, some number of trans people do in fact change their sex. It is a argument that I personally I'm sympathetic to, but I don't understand well enough to defend. So I'm not gonna like put it forth. I'd want to understand that argument better. Um, I guess I'm a little uncertain about it, but again, sympathetic, willing to acknowledge that I just don't know enough about it, and that's where my apprehension lies. Uh, oh, I missed some stuff. JK reminded Doctor. Oh, okay. Good.
Saying for me, my definition of woman is this type of biological trait, this biological trait, this biological trait. Well, that might actually be applicable because we do have trans women who've undergone.
Yeah. So just to clarify,
the
I see gonads, genitalia, secondary sex characteristics. What your sex is.
So what are
comes down
primary
to
sex
genetics,
characteristics?
things like the SRY gene. I've looked extensively into like the 40 plus intersex conditions, but the gamete view you kind of described.
Okay, so now she's actually holding herself to some standards, right? Genetics. Okay, but she was saying it's not chromosomes. So what in genetics are you talking about specifically? Something about an SRY gene. I don't know what that is, but now she's talking about the gametes view. But Hunter had already established that there are some number of cisgender women who do not produce the large gametes. Some people who are like born without ovaries or whatever. Or if if they had ovarian cancer, needed to have their ovaries removed, do they cease to be women? Well, it's again this ultimately the like transphobe concept is a woman is a person who is of like the sexual category that could conceivably give birth, but they are not required to actually be able to do that. And so a trans woman can't be because they are not of that category, even though being able to give birth isn't a requisite for the category. And like it's just this very nebulous, like circular. It doesn't actually make sense view. Um, like at the end of the day, when we're being real, it's your sex assigned at birth is the one that you have to stay in the gender that we correlate with it, or that we assign based on that. That's the actual transphobe view. They attempt to justify it post hoc with things like what she's trying to say, and that's why it doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why she's not committing to anything clear. She's just like gesturing vaguely at a cloud of things that would all have to have issues made within them for her to even begin to have to argue back in favor of her position.
Just what I take.
Okay, so but then there would still be
it wouldn't
exceptions,
again be relevant because we don't have the CRISPR technology to fully alter your genes and therefore gametes yet. And we also recognize.
Oh, and by the way, it's a complete lie. If with people like this, like if the technology existed to the point where a person, no matter what stage of their life, could go into the box and then press the gender button, or I guess the sex button in this case, and be like, I want to be this sex, and it completely changed them head to toe, biology, genetics, everything. Not a single cell in their body would be left unchanged by this. And now they were previous before they stepped into the box they were male, and when they walked out they were female. People like this would still say you're not a woman. To be clear, there is no way like no one is this committed and would say like there's a line you could cross into womanhood.
There is obviously then some exception still in your definition that does allow.
And that's fine. Even if I were to.
So then
okay, so the exceptions to your definition are fine. Cool. There are exceptions to Hunter's definition. It's still fine. Now what's their problem?
That does not make a trans woman a woman.
Wait, no, because in this case we're talking about somebody who has a vagina because they have so now they have an external female sex organ and they don't produce gametes.
I actually liked where Hunter brought this to. I think hopefully he gets to the actual follow through I think he needs to have here. I don't think this is it. I think the correct follow through would be like, cool, definitions can have exceptions, and that doesn't make them that doesn't make mean that we have to reject the definition. My definition has exceptions, but as you just agreed, that's not a problem. So what's wrong with my definition?
Just told me that person would be a woman.
Wait, if they have a vagina but do not produce gametes, the way that we would determine sex would be looking at their genes and looking at what.
So that's not true at all. I talked about this yesterday. When you determine someone's sex, we don't look at their genes. When you are assigned your gender at birth, the doctor sexes you, but they don't do a DNA test. They look at you and they go, "That's a dick," and you're a man, and you're assigned male. Or they're like, "Ah, that's a vagina," and you're assigned female. And in cases where it's intersex, they often are like, "It's more like this, so we'll do some surgery." Nobody, almost nobody, knows what their like DNA says their sex is. More and more it's becoming a thing because there's like DNA testing for stuff, but like for the most part, people do not know what their sex is, let alone what other people's sex is. Remember, her definition is like to know if someone's a woman, you have to like it is required to know their sex. So when she looks at Hunter, that means she cannot know what his sex is. She would never bite that bullet, right? Because that's ridiculous. Obviously, that's not how we do anything. Uh, yeah, it's just absolutely insane. Like, no, people do not. That's not how we determine a person's sex. That might be a more thorough way of determining a person's sex, but that's not how it ends up actually happening.
What developmental pathway they undertook, right? Given that in the mammalian.
And remember, the only reason to want to do something like that is so that you can still reject trans people who have gotten bottom surgery. It's still not good enough. It's just so that she can move the goalpost.
Kingdom, there are only 2 gametes. You can only undertake 1 of 2 developmental pathways, which are determined by transcription in your genes.
Okay. What
But
is
again,
how does
Yeah, that's not. You needed to have something better there,
Even
Hunter.
if I were to
anything?
concede all
yes,
of the-
in nature, that's how some things evolve. You said that a woman you generally try to define as the gamete position, but I'm explaining that like in my opening, I talked about the condition, about the Swire
Stewart syndrome, yeah.
yeah. Where I
Even
mean,
with that
again,
being
and by the
said,
way, I'm also
given that-
recognizing right off the bat that yes, of course, it's rare, but as rare as it might be, you would still consider
Yeah,
those people
I still
women,
account
right?
for it. So under Sawyer syndrome.
And this is Hunter where you need to go, cool. If there can be exceptions, like I said already, if there are exceptions to definitions, and that is okay, then the fact that there are exceptions to my definition is not a problem. Now we can say, now I can assert once more that my definition has not been sufficiently rebuked. What do you have to actually rebuke it? That's not an exception. Remember, exceptions aren't relevant.
So why does that make sense? So why does
I can defend it really quick. So under the biological account of what a female is, there are only 2 developmental pathways a human can undertake.
Not true at all, by the way.
2 gametes. So with that being said, even if something
there are 2 general pathways that humans do undertake, but nature doesn't work in binaries. It works in spectrums. People do undertake all sorts of differences. We simply clump together like, well, these are mostly the same. And obviously, people don't undertake only one of these 2 pathways in that, again, intersex people exist.
Blocks you from
She seems to not want to recognize that
gamete.
because transphobes can't. Like, intersex people are a huge problem for transphobes. But they exist and they are relevant to the conversation.
That doesn't mean you didn't undertake the developmental pathway to reach that point. So people with Sawyer syndrome, it depends if they haven't expressed SRY gene or not. Some do, some don't. Some are fertile, some are not. So you would need to present me a specific case with their
wait. Why does
gene code,
fertility
and then I
matter?
can determine if they're female or not.
But you would never do that. You would never, ever do that. You would simply look at them and be like, they look, maybe they look like this, and you're like, they got the skirt and they got the long hair and there's a woman, and then you're like, oh wait, do I see an Adam's apple? Oh, maybe they're not a woman, because ultimately that's what you're doing. Like, you're like this whole like presentation in a sense is a lie.
Even so, this has no bearing on the truth of the proposition, so it's not relevant.
Okay, you keep saying that, but it does. We already established it, and you already agreed.
And I already
that it
explained
does
the
actually,
biology
it could
to you, so
actually
like
have some-
you and
So
okay,
You
saying-
explained
okay,
the
so
biology to
somebody
you. No,
with
you
Down
didn't.
syndrome
Well, hold on, wait,
that
wait,
has an
because some of them
expressed
don't
SRY
have
gene. I would not
ovaries
call
at
them.
all.
1 second, just
I would
because
not call them a female if they have an expressed SRY gene, right? Not just the presence of the SRY
You
gene.
say that, but there's zero chance that that's what you're checking before you say that they're a woman. No shot.
The Y chromosome, but the expression and execution of the SRY gene and its function, if they have that, they are not a female. Is that
So
clear?
if they have no ovaries at all, would you consider that person to be
I didn't
not
mention
a female?
ovaries. So
No, she
they're
mentioned this SRY gene. All right, all right. What the fuck is the SRY gene? Is it SRI or SRY? Okay, it's SRY gene. What the fuck is the SRY gene? The SRY gene provides instructions for making a protein called the sex-determining region Y protein. This protein is involved in male typical sex development. Notice male typical because it's not just these two tracks. There's like what we consider typical and what we consider not, because nature doesn't fit into boxes, which usually follows a certain pattern based on individuals' chromosomes. People usually have 46 chromosomes in each cell. Two of the 46 chromosomes, known as X or Y, are called sex chromosomes because they help determine whether a person will develop male or female sex characteristics. Girls and women typically have two X chromosomes. Typically, as in not always. Note that that's even biologists. We're talking about. Anyway, two Y chromosome, the X chromosomes, while boys and men typically have one X chromosome, one Y chromosome. The SRY gene is found on the Y chromosome. The sex-determining region Y protein produced from this gene acts as a transcription factor, which means it attaches to specific regions of DNA and helps control the activity of particular genes. This protein starts processes that call a fetus to develop male gonads, prevents the development of female reproductive structures, uterus, and fallopian tubes. So when she's talking about, I'll try to find more information before we move on. But what she's talking about, the expression of this SRY gene. How do we know if it has been expressed? Well, we look at, did they develop gonads? Did they not develop female reproductive organs? A lot of these things are going to be really minimal. Like I said, I want to find more information about this. All right, National Institute of Health. Let's see. All right. This is way over my head. Um, let's ask how uh, dry gene express. All right. Even though SRY triggers a cascade that influences sex-specific development throughout the organism and has lifelong consequences, its expression is limited to only a few cells. This, remember, is the determining factor for Saanvi over here as to whether a person is a woman, is these few cells having their expression based through the SRY gene. At least in mice, to a narrow time window. SRY is expressed exclusively within the supporting cells of the genital ridges, directing them towards the fate of a serotoli cell, which are the primary constituents of testis cords, which sequester primordial germ cells and facilitate spermatogenesis. So it seems like the totality of SRY gene expression, and please, if someone knows better, please hit me up with more knowledge, because obviously I'm a layperson trying to find the correct information. Uh, it seems like the totality of the expression is in the genitals. But she wants to say it's not genitalia that's the relevant thing. Look, this is, I'm so glad we looked into this. I'm a little surprised at this level of dishonesty of like, no, it's the SRY gene. What is that? SRY gene expression. Well, where does that? Thanks Amazon Can. I'll catch you later. Thanks for watching. But how does that express itself? Oh, in the genitals, the thing you said you don't actually care about. Okay, thanks, buddy. Let's just double check. Oh, this is exactly what we were reading before, right? Isn't it? Yeah. SRY gene and overview. Maybe we can find out more here. This is that's a lot higher, lot higher level than I thought. Yeah, and this is the kind of thing that's like you have to like go real deep into this stuff to find. Like I'm confident she doesn't understand this shit either. I don't believe she's a fucking geneticist. Um, but you have to like know so much to debunk this nonsense. Please, for real, if anyone knows knows a way for a layperson to get an understanding of this, please let me know in the chat, in the comments somewhere. I'd like to know more about this. I I'm a layperson. I'm poking around trying to find something that's useful. There are undoubtedly people who know a lot more about this. Well, I shouldn't say undoubtedly. There because like obviously there are people who study this, but what I mean, right? Like somebody's got to know a way for me to get a grasp on this, even as a layperson, to talk for what she's talking about. But from what we found, she's who either she doesn't understand what the SRY gene is about. She's just heard that SRY expression is like a sexual is like a sex determinative factor, and is just like, that's the thing I want to look for because it's the thing that like people haven't yet found the flaws in. Or she knows what she's doing and she's actively hiding behind presumed lack of knowledge about what the SRY gene does and how we determine if it's been expressed or not.
Sex is determined genetically. Those are secondary sex characteristics that can help us out, but they're not the main determinant.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was still talking about the gametes part, so maybe I misunderstood a little bit there.
Yeah, so eggs are produced in the ovaries, right? But you can still undertake a developmental pathway towards the production of eggs without actually actualizing the organ of ovaries.
Right. So once again, your definition completely fails because now in order to understand who would be a woman, we first have to establish who would be a female. So we have to gene test people.
Which we don't.
To determine who's a woman. How does this... You realize people will call themselves a woman or express themselves a certain way.
Okay. Hunter's hitting it up.
Been gene tested.
That's fine.
There's
just
obviously
because
a
you
social
yourself.
identity form.
But you would have... But no. She's saying that's fine. You can express yourself. But you would have to say they're wrong. Or that they don't know what they're talking about, right? Like they're talking, they're claiming facts that they don't know. Depending on your level of, depending on how strict you are with what a lie is. Like Aaron Ra might call that a lie if he held your view, because he's known for saying that if you assert confidently something that you cannot prove, then that is a lie. Well, you couldn't like. Or if you assert as fact something you don't know to be true, and you can know it if you can show it, like you would have to say that these people, that almost everybody is like confidently stating without knowing what their sex is, and that's a more workable definition than Hunter's or a self-ID view or anything else
involved here, right?
But just because there's further inquiry necessary or further testing necessary to discern a truth of the matter has no bearing on the truth of the matter.
Oh, it has bearing on the fact that you are willing to exclude people from the categories. Actually, that's another thing. You want to say trans women aren't women, but you have no clue what their SRY gene expression is. You haven't done any genetic testing of trans people or whatever. You have no clue. But you're happy to say they're not women, and you are without knowing this, even though you could be completely wrong, because that's not how you're determining anything, because you're lying to us about this.
If I were to show you fool's gold and real gold, and they looked phenotypically identical, are you saying that
phenotypically? I know what she means, but gold doesn't have phenotypes. It's fine. I know what she means, but it's a very silly statement.
I'm not saying because of the extra testing that... No, I'm sorry. My point is that your definition, again, fails in serving functionality. Because on our...
Which, remember, she's bitten the bullet on. Gene testing. She definitely learned from this debate because when she... Oh, I'm sorry, Hunter. That's a bad frame to stop on. She's definitely learned from this because the other debate I saw her in, which I think happened after this one, she didn't do a lot of the thing. She didn't make a lot of the mistakes she's making now, and it wasn't as obvious how much she was lying about stuff. But it was also a different context where she was debating Vosh, who was taking the self-ID view, so she could just focus entirely on the circularity, even though that's not a problem either.
We're not going to be even looking at... Obviously, we're not going to be looking at people's ovaries or their genitalia or whatnot.
Yeah. Which I never mentioned, by the way, but yeah.
Well, no. You didn't mention outright, but as we just looked into, the SRY gene expression, mostly it gets expressed in the effect it has on a person's genitalia. in like in which in like whether gonads will develop and whether female reproductive organs will be prevented from developing. Uh, so you didn't say that out loud, but you did say it.
There is somebody who is expressing themselves this way, is it possible then that you would most likely consider them a woman, right? You would refer to them as a
Yeah,
woman.
so I think there's a difference.
And you're
between
happy
an
to and you're happy to like make the argument. Like honestly, Hunter, I think this is a great line. If you wanted to be like really aggressive in how you would do this, just start making the argument that she's not a woman, and then like make her prove that she is. It's rude, but like um depending on like the texture of the conversation, you can illustrate very clearly and very quickly how her worldview is clearly not how she's actually approaching things, but also unworkable if she wants to keep pretending that that's how she does.
difference and something that's actually true. And this goes back to the gold example. Like, if I were to show you fool's gold and real gold, the average human is going to look at those two and say they're both gold, right? Like, because if they look exactly the same, they're both gold. We need further testing to verify.
By the way, something funny about that. I've seen pyrite. That's what fool's gold is. It doesn't actually look like gold. Maybe when you find gold like in the earth, which I guess I haven't seen, maybe it looks similar. It's just kind of funny to me of like, well, it's like kind of gold color and it sparkles, so like it can be confusing to people if you like aren't familiar. But it's not relevant at all. It was just always funny to me of like, wait, people thought this was gold. It's very clearly not gold. It's very obviously not gold. But that's also from a perspective of like now we know what the thing. Now we know about pyrite, and right now we know the difference in the pitfalls or whatever. It was just very fun. It was just something that I was reminded of in this particular example.
The truth of the matter, but we make inferences. The same goes for female, and the same goes for woman. We might make an inference, but we know further testing is required to determine the truth.
No, we don't know that. You're asserting that. But nobody operates this way. People claim to operate this way so that they can exclude trans people from their actual gender, but nobody actually does this.
Of the matter.
Sure. Okay. So then you do though recognize, before I go into my second part, so you recognize then the establishment of certain gender characteristics though that are like separate from sex.
Like
Oh,
sex
Hunter, backing off the point. I think you had her in a really good spot. If you pressed in the right way, I think you would have made some ground. This feels like changing tack a little bit. It might work out, but I think you were very close to
like
making actual progress.
Gender, behavior, characteristics, expectations, roles. You recognize that as like a thing, though, right? That's separate.
And what he's talking about is exactly what we were talking about yesterday with someone like Daria, right? You can't identify any sexual characteristics in this person, but you can be like, oh, she's wearing a skirt, she has long hair, her name is Daria. Like these are gendered traits that we do use to identify people's genders.
From sex?
Yeah, gender norms exist, yeah.
And since nobody is going to subject people to all the testing in social environment, they'll resort going with whatever gender the person says they are. Yeah, well, so that's how people ought to go with whatever gender a person says they are. Part of why this debate exists is to give cover for people who want to not do that, right? To say, no, your gender is the one you were assigned at birth, and you can't change it, and I don't care. I don't care what you tell me. You know, you'll never be. The people will say like, oh, a man will never be a woman or whatever. As it turns out, I do agree that a man will never be a woman. Good thing trans women aren't men. But yeah, it really could be as easy as, well, you tell me what gender you are, and I'm like, cool, and then we move on, and we don't need anything past that. But unfortunately, people don't do that. And people try to justify that kind of behavior through arguments like this. And people like Saanvi give cover to that by pretending that this position is at all like philosophically rigorous or academic or whatever. I mean that even if Hunter's correct, that becomes the natural way anyway. Well, kind of like it ends up not being, right. It ends up being a lot more or sorry, if Saanvi is correct. Yeah. Well, that's what I mean, right? Like, Saanvi is Hunter is the person on the left. Saanvi is the one on the right. Saanvi is the no position. Hunter is the yes. Um, but or is Saanvi wouldn't be able to say, but I can. Saanvi is the woman and Hunter is the man. Uh, yeah. So like, yes, this is what I mean about the like myth of the gender essentialist model. People don't actually do this. And no, it is not the normal way that we've approached things, but by pretending it is, she gets to do what she's been doing, which is pretend she's the default. She doesn't have to support her position. Any problems that exist aren't relevant. Only Hunter has to prove his case, and to a level of specificity that she does not find necessary for her own position.
Something that exists as a result of human interaction that is correlated to biology, right? Because a lot of this gene testing thing boils
Is
down
it
to
correlated
sex
to biology?
ultimately.
Because kind of what you mentioned in your opening statement, is wearing a dress correlated to biology?
Do you think it
I
is?
would say no,
I
but currently
think no,
yes.
but you said you seem to agree with me, but I
Well,
guess not anymore.
Wait,
Wait.
what the fuck are you talking about? You also think it's correlated. Correlation, you understand, isn't causation because you didn't say caused, right? You understood the correlation. As it turns out, most of the people who wear dresses are women. That's a correlation. And sorry, excuse me. Most of the people who wear dresses are also assigned female at birth. That is a correlation. Now, a lot of that is due to due to gender expectations and gender assignment and reinforcing of like gender norms and whatever. But the correlation exists, and you know that. You would say yes. I don't know what the hell you're talking
Wait,
about.
I said wearing a dress is not correlated with biology.
Correct. And now you
Oh,
just said
sorry. Okay,
sex.
wait. You're saying it's not
It does
correlated?
have a correlation. So which is it?
Okay, I'm sorry. Did I say correlated or caused? Because if I said correlated, that would have been my mistake and my
No,
miswording.
correlated,
So-
right? Like, yeah.
So okay, yeah.
And this is great. By the way, this happens all the time in conversations. Sometimes you'll misspeak. So like Sanvi's not like really doing that much of like the gotcha stuff, but she is like, well, you said the thing. I'm going to operate based on the argument you made. And it's really good on Hunter's part to be like, hold on, stop. If this is the mistake I might have made, if that's here's what I actually think. Sanvi is a lot more willing, I think it seems to like, okay, let's find out what your argument actually is, than a lot of like really openly bad faith interlocutors that I've seen before. But it's good on Hunter's part to be like, all right, stop, hold on. Clearly there's a miscommunication. Let me establish what I think. Move on.
Well, no, of this whole conversation, I've been acknowledging that gender is correlated with sex. But the
And if this happens to you
correlation
in your
is
like day-to-day life when you're arguing with people, for real, just feel free to be like, hold on, I might have misspoken. And this is an advantage of a particular kind of listening that I think people could stand to get better at. I don't know what to call it, but if you listen to what someone says and like kind of constantly ask yourself what would have to be true about the world for it to make sense for them to have said this. Uh, Not, I mean, sometimes what would have to be true would be absolute nonsense. But in a case like this, like, what would have to be true? Oh, it would have to be that I said something that I didn't mean, right? And you can catch this up, and it's very helpful. I see this happen all the time in arguments in real life where people miss this kind of thing, and I think it's something that's very easy to learn and get better at. You just have to be aware that listening is listening and understanding and interpreting correctly is a skill, and it's not just something that you do passively, and you have to work at it and understand what does a person mean with what they say.
we're doing. That's the social part. We have a gender thing. We have certain expectations, characteristics, traits, roles that we correlate with biology, but
Okay,
it's not
but it's
caused
not
by
true,
the
right?
biology.
But it's not true. Like,
What do you mean it's not true?
The blue and pink thing. There's nothing inherent about being a boy that makes you like blue. There's nothing
Correct.
inherent about being a girl that makes you like.
And if
pink,
I'm not
just stuff
mistaken, like
that.
100 years ago, those are switched. Those are the other way around. That pink was for boys and boys and blue was for girls. Like 100, 150 years ago, something like that. So yeah, there's nothing inherently that ties the two.
You're saying we assign those things to those individuals, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that
Okay.
part I would agree with. But with that being said, I think another implication would be societies differentiate in this. Some societies would have the opposite view of ours and would say that people that our
That's
leaders,
not a
people that go
problem
out
for
and be
Hunter.
breadwinners, are actually what are typically casted as women and females.
That's not a
So
problem though.
under
This is
this
another
view,
instance of
if
presenting something as a problem that isn't a problem whatsoever.
you travel to, say, the tribe I just mentioned, the African tribe, like, would that make your gender change?
Well, no, because your gender identity would be based upon whatever cultural norms you were kind of socialized into originally.
Oh, like
I
you
remember I don't know if Hunter has said, I think Hunter said as much, but by being a part of the category, you are defining in part what it means for that category. You are defining masculinity or femininity in his terms by being that and behaving differently than expectations, right? You're defining what it means to be feminine, if in the case of a woman, yeah.
you grew up with.
Just yeah, more or less, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it's probably not that simple, but like more or less, it just like I said.
Oh, and also that culture that she describes that has like opposite gender roles, they might look at someone from like if I were to travel to and like go to this group to this society, they might look at me and say, "Oh, you're being such a woman," or whatever their term for it is, right? Like, why do you act so womanly? They would very likely say that. Um, so it's not like that's not weird at all. Like, yes, there's a lot of cultural stuff involved. We talked about this yesterday with let me see if it's still in this in the quick history. No, I guess not. Um, like we were looking at this just yesterday. Like this person, this person was very much a man in his time period, and it was what he was doing. Like, and as we said, like good luck telling him that he's dressed like a woman and keeping your head, you know. But nowadays, clearly wearing high heels and tights is not something we associate with being a man. Now, men can do this, and in fact, they do. But obviously, the expectations have changed, and now, if someone were dressed like this, their manhood would be, well, by some ruder people, would be impugned. That's a real man. Hell yeah. Yeah, man, like, this guy fucking. No, is that a sword? No, it's a scepter. Um, Yeah, but the point remains like yes, cultures change and how these things are, and yeah, cultures where if you I don't know if I like if I went to to this culture dressed like I am, I don't know if they'd question my man. They might question my like upbringing, be like you're dressed like a commoner or whatever. I have all my arms are showing or whatever. But oh, he does have a sword. Oh, it's right here on his hip. I just didn't. I was just wasn't paying attention. But if this person were to were to walk around society now, some ruder people would say, "Oh, you're dressed like a woman or whatever." He's wearing high heels and tights for God's sake. Uh, so yeah, this isn't a problem, Saanvi. This is a thing.
How like you can be a football fan, but what it means to even be a football fan in Brazil is literally means to be a fan of a different sport even. But it doesn't mean that you're not a football fan as far as
I don't
your
like the football
identity
example because
in
like clearly there's a
American
transition issue,
sports, right?
translation
So,
issue.
yes, it can change and be certain like culturally relevant, but that just further demonstrates that it's a socially constructed thing, that there's this entity, this collection of traits, right? So
Another good example is if you remember when we were talking about Mulan a couple weeks ago with the "Bring Honor to Us All" song. The expectations for women were like obedience and servility and grace and yada yada etc. Whereas in our society, that is one example of what a woman could be. Another example could be like a girl boss, or another example could be like there's like a lot of things. I don't want to like list another example could be like the really butch women that we saw previously. It's another authentic expression of womanhood, but um like not falling into any of these categories. Like these the fact that there's a difference between what is expected here and there in like different societies doesn't mean that those gender like that you change gender so much as you don't meet the expectations as much, and you would define it separately, or like start to define it differently than it had been prior. That's how we have examples of like very butch women as being authentically women, because 50 years ago, sadly, that wasn't as that it wasn't as accepted, and a lot of people still don't accept it. But now we recognize that due to a lot of struggles on their part to be seen for who they are, now a lot more people are like understand the authenticity of womanhood expressed in that way.
That exists separate from sex. The correlation exists because of us. So when you talk about like gene testing people and everything else, that really does come down to sex. That doesn't come down to gender. So that's
Okay,
where
yeah,
I know
so-
we disagree.
Yeah, I
because
think that's
that-
obviously, yeah, that's where we disagree on is the sex gender distinction and how that's sort of applied.
So
So
you don't believe that there's a distinction between, or what is your position generally on that? Because that might help us get somewhere here.
well, I mean, if the definition of woman is adult human female, clearly there's a necessary condition in there about what your sexual biology is. But with that even being said,
Well, you say that, but obviously it's not necessary as far as what is considered a woman because nobody checks for that, right? So like necessary is a little bit of a cheaty word here. It's more of a expected criteria, but not actually necessary because you have no fucking clue.
I think that the definition you're proposing, it would at least mean that gender is relative to society to various societies. Is that correct?
Yeah, probably.
Maybe not your
Yes.
gender, just the
Yeah.
concept in general.
This external social.
Like if there were a society where gender roles were completely different, where the way I am is what you would expect from women, and the way women are is expected from men, and I were to live in that society for an extended period of time, I would probably have pretty significant gender dysphoria and feel more comfortable in a woman's being perceived as a woman because that would be a more authentic expression of myself. Now, for me personally, I probably wouldn't have any any issues with how my body looks, but I might if it were so ubiquitous that to behave like this, you would also be expected to look female and if you didn't, you would be misgendered and treated differently. Like that would be a pretty significant problem for me, and I would have to change absolutely nothing about my personality for that to be the case. It would be exactly me. I've changed not at all, but the society operates differently, and so my gender would not be the same. Like, yeah, I would identify as a different gender so that I could be me. And like imagining things like that, like I haven't heard trans people describe that as a reasonable way of understanding their experience. If it is, I hope I've accurately described one way that a trans person could feel. But and if I have, it should be pretty clear, like how understandable that is. Like for real, if just society was different and the way you are was expected to was not was something that was strange and the other gender was supposed to act like that and not the one you were assigned, you would probably feel pretty uncomfortable and want to be considered as part of another gender, even if you don't meet with those criteria exactly, because I don't meet with masculine criteria exactly. That's not an admission either. Nobody does. But in some way, I define what it means to be a man. Just like in that society, I would think that I would transition and define in part what it means to be a woman by being me. It's that simple. At least I think it's that simple.
Construct of gender, absolutely, yeah, it's a socially constructed thing. That's why we have conversations about like what it even means to be a woman has in many ways changed over time, right?
Yeah. So would you say like many more conservative places that view a woman as an adult human female, that's what the society generally views as a woman, and that's that society's conception of gender, would you then say in that
It's broader.
society-
So
No.
so this is the problem of us being a descriptive art. Man, she's like hitting all of the problems that I expected. This is the problem of the question at hand being a descriptive question and not a prescriptive one. To say, well, it is the case that they treat it that way, so wouldn't you have to be like, wouldn't you have to acknowledge that by their society standard is like, well, it's more what I care what how we should treat the definition. I don't care that the expectations of like in a way, I don't care that think they have a biological essentialist view of the world. They don't, by the way. They think they do, but they don't. It doesn't really matter.
Because it's broader than that. It's not going to be like my neighborhood's view of gender, especially with access we
can
have to the
even take
resources.
like
We have hold on. We have a general understanding of the external points of gender. Like yes, we recognize what's masculine and what's feminine, what we might label as being such. That's going to you're going to have knowledge of that outside of like your local community.
Right.
Oh,
So,
and also that like what she just did was something she wouldn't ever accept otherwise. Because if I were to say, oh, my culture conflates sex and gender, which is basically what she said, she's apparently on board. But if I say my culture it conflates like like, or my culture says that Christianity doesn't require you to believe in the Trinity, or like it doesn't require you to believe in to be a Trinitarian, like she claimed in another debate that is a requisite. She would never accept that, right? No, she'd be like, well, they were wrong about that about that definition, but she's only willing to accept it when it excludes trans people.
I can even take like maybe a country if that would work better, like small countries. So if the vast majority, overwhelming amount of people in that country directly tied gender to sex, and that was their society's conception of gender, wouldn't that still make a trans woman in that society not a woman?
No.
Well, based on their definition, probably not. But I mean,
But
right
also,
now,
that society would either have to have no concept of gender, like actual gender, right? Or if they did have gender roles, then you would identify with the gender role and disagree about the necessity of the tie to sex, just like we're doing right now. That's just what we're doing. It's this debate. It's what's happening right now.
tie it to biology. So right now, with the current definition we have, that's why we're having this argument, right? So
Ah,
We're
you even
arguing
pointed it
they
out.
might not define it that way, but you know what? You might have over here.
And then you
I'm
say what
religious
Hunter
in the sense
said,
that I'm a
which is that
Christian.
there's a problem with that definition. Wild, isn't it?
So I have this identity, I have this belief internally, but in this over, I don't know, rural, isolated island, right? In order to be classified as religious, you need to be involved in human sacrifice. They might have different standards or different definitions you need to meet, but that doesn't negate the identity that was originally built.
I think there's a little. So do you think that a Christian is somebody who identifies as a Christian? Like is
I think
To
some,
some
I think that
extent,
a
yeah.
Christian is ultimately somebody whose internal belief is that of there probably is a form of identity as far as identifying themselves as like a sinner, theologically speaking, but like identifying themselves as a sinner, but more so it's just an internal belief. Yes, it's about
another thing I
internally
was gonna
believing that Jesus Christ is Lord.
I think I kind of forgot to mention this in my presentation, but I don't think there's any feature you obtain in reality simply as identifying as it. And I'm not
Oh, I know you don't think that, but you're wrong. We talked about this the other day. Like being a fan is a really, really good example. I like, I've seen 3-year-olds identify as being sports fans. They don't know what they're talking about, but their family is that, or, and by me, I don't know if you're gonna go argue with the 3-year-old that they're wrong about it, or argue that the 3-year-old is wrong. But that seems kind of weird. But even if I were to now say I'm a what I don't know, I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan. I said that. Okay, am I wrong? Like, how would you ever prove that I'm wrong? Uh, you'd say, oh, do you ever go to their games? No, but fans don't have to go to their games. What if I watch them at home? Well, do you watch them at home? No, but I just really like them, and that's kind of what we mean by being a fan. There's no requisite there, even though someone like she insists that there are. She has in another debate said like, oh, but there are other necessary criteria, like you'd have to know what the sport is. That's not true. That's why I mentioned the 3-year-old. But there are, for what it's worth, also requisites for gender identity that if you're going to be that broad about it, we could include. Like you would have to know what a gender what a gender is, or like know that there is such a thing as gender. Like sure, boom, there you go. Like there's a requisite for you. It's the same thing. It's just as meaningless.
not sure why gender would be
As what?
the one that we special plead to that.
It's not
I don't
special
know.
pleading.
There's not any real trait that with what Christianity?
There's no, just in general, there's no feature that we obtain in reality simply as identifying as having such.
So what? There's plenty of
Do you have
You're
a
gonna need to elaborate.
counterexample?
Maybe I'm missing it. It sounds like you're saying there's
Yeah.
no real objective thing that happens or changes
Yeah,
because
he's
of
not
our
understanding
identity.
the argument.
That's what it sounds like you're saying.
No, you don't. Your identity is essentially not valid if you just obtained it by identifying as having it.
As
So,
identifying
let's
as
take
having
the
it. Well, yeah,
football
Oh,
but I
he's
mean,
not following
example,
shit.
like talking about American football. Do you think somebody who's never even seen what a football looks like, never watched a game on TV, never been to one, never seen their friends play, nothing of the sort, can still identify as a football fan
Yes.
when they
if
don't
Oh
they
yeah,
know
even
the
absolutely.
concept of it at all,
Yeah,
probably
absolutely.
not.
Right. So there's still
Oh
necessary.
no, I think they could. Yeah, like kids are often like fans of the team that their family likes. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about, but they're like, yeah, I love them because my family likes them, and they might only know what the logo is or whatever. Even if they've seen a football, they might not know that like that's what the game is or how the rules work or the contrast between that team and another team. Like this, no, you absolutely can. But even if you want to say like, yeah, you have to have there is some other requisite. There are the requisites that she is talking about here are so broad, as we just said, that yeah, we can find some for gender as well. You have to know that there's a thing as gender, such a thing as gender. Boom. All right, you did it.
Conditions, even though we probably haven't fleshed them out to be
Well,
something.
wait.
Rather
Of
than
course,
just
you're gonna wait.
identifying
Wait.
as.
Well, that's not the necessary condition. Being you must interact with an external social construct in order to have an internal identity on the basis of that construct. Yeah, of course, that's a necessary condition.
Well, yeah. So we can accept that. So again, there's no feature you obtain in reality simply as identifying as it. There's
So
always
so now like now if we're going to say like that these that there can be additional requisites that are this broad, then her statement becomes true, right? That you can that there's no feature that you can obtain merely by identifying as it, but those requisites, the additional requisites could be exceptionally broad. So gender is also not a thing that you obtain merely by identifying. You also need to know that there is such a thing as gender, and also need to know what which gender it is that you are identifying with, and you need to know like I don't know how to speak words or like how or like you need to have a sense of self as we've established, you know? Like you have to have an internal perception. Sure, these are requisites done. Most football fans don't actually know how the game works. Is that true? Likewise, almost Christians are so many variants. Yeah, also true. Yeah, that's a good point, Peachy. Sorry, I didn't notice that. I hadn't seen some of your
some
comments there.
conditions.
So in this case, the condition would be having an internal perception. that
Boom.
aligns
All
with
right,
cultural
Hunter,
views of
killing
femininity.
it. Great job.
In order
I
to
know,
be
Perfect
a Christian,
answer.
in order to
Perfect
be a Christian,
answer.
the
No
condition
notes.
would be having an internal belief that you yourself are a sinner in need of God's love and grace, and that Jesus Christ is Lord.
I disagree that that's the requisite for Christianity, but he's making the good point of like, okay, there are requisites. Yeah, sure. And gender, and he gave requisites for a gender identity that trans people still meet, and so she should have no problems, right? But of course she does.
Externally, that you are a Christian, it doesn't mean that you are not a Christian if you fail to do this.
Right. I mean, yeah, I'm sure there's still some necessary conditions like believing Jesus Christ is Lord or whatever, like you mentioned.
Just like there's necessary condition in being a woman, which is having that internal perception.
So that's why I wanted to ask, like, what do you mean by internal perception? Because maybe I was strong on you earlier, but the only thing I can think of is your preferences and your psychosocial interaction. That's it.
Yeah, it's going to be the
to
way
my
you
view,
perceive
Hunter's
yourself.
definition there is just basically like identifying as a woman, but with extra steps. But we'll see if he says something more cogent.
In relation to this, it could be in some ways like I feel that I fit better in this category, but it's most likely going to be more than just like I kind of like the color pink. And also, there is such a thing, of course, as being like a boy who is much more comfortable identifying with masculinity, cultural views of masculinity, but might like certain elements of femininity, whether that's like wearing pink or maybe they think princesses or Barbies are cool or something.
Femboys are a thing.
Girl, right? That's
right,
just
right.
right. So
these two seem caught between saying genders are meaningless versus genders are absolute. I'm not sure I agree, Peachy Keen. It seems like both of them acknowledge a reality of gender. Hunter is actually less saying gender is meaningless than I would. Is it wrong to say that it's somewhere in between? I think Hunter is saying it's somewhere in between, by the way. I think only Saanvi is saying it's absolute. and he's saying that the requisite the definition he has is trying to find an in between, even if you feel it leans towards the meaningless. Uh, there, I think he's trying to encapsulate in his definition the fact that people do ascribe meaning to it. Now, personally, I think it is ultimately meaningless outside of the meaning we ascribe to it. But it's kind of in the same way that, like, I, as an atheist, understand that religion does mean something to people. Even if I don't think there is a truth behind the metaphysical claims, it is clear that people care deeply about what religion means to them. And in the same way, like, you can acknowledge the same with gender. I think Hunter is trying to capture that in his definition and acknowledge that it is not completely meaningless. But the problem is, it does skew towards it is like on the spectrum of meaninglessness and absolute. It does skew towards the meaningless. Yeah, likewise with yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, precisely. And for the same reason, Peachy Keen is why I think racial abolition is preferable to racial equality, even though racial equality is also good. Um, because it should be considered meaningless. Same with gender, right? Like, gender abolitionism. That's kind of the idea. It's like, it means something to people, but maybe we could do better. We would do better without it. Uh, and I don't think Hunter is saying it's meaningless. I think he does have a meaning there. It's just very hard to capture the vibe of what it means to, like, feel womanly, I guess.
Holds.
Which is, I think, what he's pointing at. I think when he has his definition, what he's actually trying to point at is feeling like a woman, uh, or feeling like a man, or feeling like whatever gender. But it's hard to encapsulate because we don't. It's hard to describe. We just don't have the words for it, other than, being a man, or feeling like a man, feeling like a woman, whatever. Uh, but I think that's what he's trying to point to.
Of social and behavioral characteristics.
That makes you the. Well, hold on. I'm trying to understand a little bit more your broader argument, because you're saying there's necessary criteria that you must meet for anything
Or
to be valid.
sufficient criteria, one of the two.
Sufficient criteria for
it can be either
valid.
or. I'm just saying, you don't obtain something just by identifying as it.
Okay, yes, just identifying as, if you're going to say, like, I guess that would be a good argument if someone's like, a woman is someone who says I identify as a woman, who says I identify as a woman, but
Right. Yeah,
but there's
more
more.
so
Go, I
that
disagree
But
about the
hold on, wait,
circularity
because
there.
there's more to my definition.
Yeah, I know. I'm not trying to straw man your definition. I was gonna apply it.
If we're talking about somebody like a Christian, though, if they have that internal belief, do they meet that necessary condition?
If they believe, as you mentioned earlier, then yes.
Right. So then why, if trans women have that internal belief, can't that also be meeting that necessary condition?
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask. So, like, take dresses or the color pink or Barbies, like you kind of just mentioned. Do you have to have a belief that you like those Barbies, or do you have to actually like them? Or do you have to simply have an internal perception that you like them? Like, that's what I'm not
Well,
understanding.
neither. It seems like what he's saying is you have to have an internal belief the the like womanliness of yourself, or in the femininity of yourself, or the association with the category we consider more feminine in yourself. Like, that seems like the belief he's talking about, not liking pink. That's by no means a requisite for being a woman, and neither of them, I think, would say that it is.
You would probably sort of just gravitate towards that more and more. I mean, if you listen to most people, I know, like Blair White even talked about just like having an experience as she was getting older and sort of interacting with more gendered spaces, having more of this sort of discomfort with not fitting in certain categories or not feeling right here. Again, a lot of it isn't going to be like this. Obviously, it's not going to be like intellectualizing, like, do internally I desire to play with Barbie? Like, it's going to be more like, what do you gravitate towards? How do you end up seeing yourself in regards to these traits and characteristics? Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
that's exactly what I mean. It seems like Hunter is trying to point generally to the feeling of, like, womanliness, uh, which I think makes his definition a lot more reasonable. But it, of course, is very difficult to do. I think he's doing a pretty good, like, as good a job as one can do. It's about whether, like, Saanvi is, like, gonna understand that that's what he's gesturing towards.
kind of asking, like, what is the threshold of these characteristics that you must meet in order to be considered a woman?
what is it like? So, what elements of that internal perception must be met? Is that what you're asking me? Because I don't know.
Right, because
I
you
don't know
said
if I
like
have like an
people
exact
might
line.
naturally gravitate towards these things in terms of that's just what you like. That's not reducible. But I wanted to ask like, what is that criteria of threshold things that you must meet in order to be considered a woman?
Heads up, we got to go into the Q&A pretty quick here as we're
I mean,
past
he's
Okay.
already been
15
clear
Yeah.
about that. Is that like that feeling of internal femininity or whatever, or like the feeling of womanliness, as I would prefer to describe it. But I think we're talking about the same thing, even though we're using different words. He's already made that clear. But what she wants is like the list of things that you have to like and dislike and traits you have to possess and not possess or whatever. A degree of specificity that, again, she would be unwilling to saddle herself with when defending her own position because she understands it's unreasonable. This is I'm a little surprised to see this come out in a discussion of gender. The uh, the fallacy of specificity. Like this happens a lot when it's discussions of immigration. It's like, oh well, what's the exact number of people we should allow into the country? Well, it doesn't really matter. The point is, we're talking about the broad concepts of broad terms, and if I tell you a number off by like 3 people or whatever, it doesn't really make a difference. It's kind of what's happening here, and I'm pretty surprised to see it, even with how Sanvi has been debating this far.
I don't know if I have like a exact criteria, but that's why I say it's the internal perception, because that's going to manifest itself differently for everybody. So it's not going to be like you must
Oh, that's
wear
pretty good,
pink
yeah.
and lipstick, etc., or
Yeah,
you
what it
must
means to be a
internally
woman
feel this
also
way.
exists differently in the minds of everybody, right? This is a concept we talk about a lot, or that's been covered a lot by philosophers and linguists. Of like, inside your own head, you have the concept of the word, and that we have no way of determining the amount to which that overlays with another person's concept of that word. Um, like some of the more nebulous ones are really good examples. Things like justice. What do we mean by that? But even if we want to talk about like chair, what I envision when I picture chair in my head is by no means going to be the same as yours, but we can more or less like realize we're talking about vaguely the same things, and that's kind of what he's talking about. What it means to be a woman or to be feminine is going to exist very differently in everybody's heads, and to identify and associate with that is going to be a little bit different for every person. But doing so is necessary and sufficient for being a woman to him, which I think is very reasonable. And I think it does put the like identify as a woman thing in a way that's more accessible to people who will pretend that circularity is an issue, like Sanvi, where because it doesn't appear as circular, but the only way we can determine if someone has that internal perception of themselves is by asking how they identify. So it works out, practically speaking, in the same positive way. That talking about it now, I do like Hunter's definition a lot more than I did at the outset, though I still don't fully love it. I think it's I think I still prefer just the self ID view, even though this is a I think his definition is a very good attempt at trying to define such a nebulous concept.
It's more so like if you have this internal perception, it's going to manifest itself in different ways. So I don't know if
Yeah.
it would be fair for me to be like, you must check these boxes of everything.
Yeah, and I think the problem with that is what if somebody's internal perception is they just need to meet one feminine archetype and then they can be a woman?
What if their internal perception? That wouldn't be an internal perception. That would just be like an internal belief or like opinion they have.
Well, that is like what is an internal perception if not a belief or a preference? Like
In this case, I'm talking about a perception of yourself in regards to an external construct. So just saying, well, I'm going to now perceive that in order to be a woman, it actually means somebody who really likes flying airplanes. So now that I fly airplanes, I'm a woman. Like, no, because it has to actually relate to the external social construct to ultimately have a form of utility as well.
yeah, and if it has to relate to the external social construct, I think that goes back to the example that I sort of posited earlier. Like, if the overwhelming, like 99.9% of society in a country thinks that a woman is a female, you would agree then that in that society, their gender identity, a male's gender identity as a woman would not be valid.
A
Well,
male.
if that were true, but it's not. To be, I don't think that if that were true, I'd have to think about more whether I agree if her premise is correct, then the conclusion would be correct. I'd have to think a little bit more about it, and I don't really want to right this second. But to be clear, society does not think that, and that kind of pushback is where I've really been left wanting in conversations with people like this. Of like, don't let them have that. It's not true. Don't let them assume their position is the default one. It's a myth.
Builds gender identity as a woman would. Well, no, not at all, because there have been people who have different gender identities in societies that have been more strongly in enforcing the correlation between sex and gender. I think
So
that
then, is
gender
it
and sex
really
are always
socially
going to exist
constr-
as a concept. Are you saying if a
Okay.
society exists in which they say we we have there is no such thing as
I guess the
genders?
problem I would have with her, I thought about it more as I was listening. I guess the problem I would have with her idea there goes back to what I was saying before. If a society where like 99.9 whatever percent of people believed in that association of the gender and sex, like wouldn't then the identification be insufficient? But of course, there's one of two situations. Either they have a concept of gender that is not directly related to sex, things like the expectations of how you should wear, what you should wear, how you should dress, from whatever. In which case, clearly gender and sex are not the same thing, even though people think it is, and clearly you can associate with the gender and not the sex, even if people think that that's the case. Or there's no concept of gender as distinct from sex, in which case there probably wouldn't be people trying to who would feel more comfortable in the other role anyway. If there was okay, you have the gender and sex are the same, and there are no expectations based on that. I don't know if there would be trans people. Maybe there would be, um, but it would probably manifest differently than what we see now, where a person's gender identity is pretty relevant to that factor or to that experience.
Just in order to be considered a woman, it must only be this biological thing. Would that person then not be yeah, I guess by their definition, maybe not. But
Okay.
I mean, because we already have tried to be defining people, right, on that biological thing, even right here in the U.S., and it's not working. It doesn't
Yeah.
serve nearly as much functionality.
Yeah.
I'm
and
glad that
I think, like,
I'm glad that he keeps making clear it doesn't work. So like we if you ever want to like start proposing that again, like he'll come after it. It doesn't work. It's not functional. It's way less effective than people pretend it is.
another thing is what's masculine and feminine does vary per culture and per
Yep,
where in the world that you go.
correct,
So I
and that's
think
not a problem.
in one place, your beliefs, your preferences, what you gravitate towards would be more in line with feminine things. But then you go to
Yeah.
another
Yes,
place,
correct,
and
yeah.
they're more in line with like what
And your gender
masculine
wouldn't
things
change
or
in part
things that are
because of
even
like your self-perception is going to be based probably on the culture from which you were raised and which you come from. But if you spend a significant amount of time in a culture where it's different and maybe your gender better aligns with another, or your sense of self better aligns with a different gender, then maybe you would change your gender. Maybe you would feel more it would be that you align more with a different gender than the one you thought. But we carry some amount of our culture with us is something to remember.
gender neutral. I think that sort of implies that somebody is a woman in one place, but in another place they
They
would be
might not
non-binary
be.
or simply
Not
a
at
man.
all. No, your identity can be valid from one culture if it's culturally relevant. We already
How?
went over
If
this.
you gravitate
Just like the
towards what
religious
that
thing.
society associates with masculine things, how would you be a woman?
Because you carry the concept of your culture
Wait,
in
if
your
you live
head,
in a
right? Like you bring it with you. This is why Americans don't go when Americans go to Italy or France or China or wherever, they are identifiably American, and there are jokes and stereotypes about what Americans are like. If it were just like this if we didn't take our culture with us, that would be the case, right? People would blend right in. But no, we take our culture with us, and the sense of self that we have is based often not is based more on the culture that we are familiar with than the one we are presently standing in.
Society in which the definition to be religious is believe this way as far as Christianity, but you go to a different society which says in order to be religious, you must commit human sacrifice. Are you no longer religious? The society would probably not define you as religious since they have their own.
Oh, and yeah, by the way, that is definitely a thing. I'm glad he mentioned this. I had forgotten about that. Like, I'm familiar. If I remember right, it's in Judaism, before the fall of the Second Temple, there was a lot more like ritual and like animal sacrifice that you were supposed to do, and you had to like to be a Jew, you had to physically go to that temple. Like, it was a lot of what you do is how you are part of that religion. But after the fall of the temple, obviously you couldn't do that anymore, and so rabbinic Judaism came about. And now being a Jew has absolutely nothing to do with that. So if a modern person who is fully Jew, like even a very religious Jewish person, were to go back in time somehow and encounter people who were Jewish like before the fall of the temple, they probably wouldn't be considered Jewish. They're not doing what Jews are supposed to do. Yeah, cultures change, and like, would they be wrong to say they're Jewish? Well, I don't think so. But it's a different cultural understanding of what that means. That's not a problem. That's a feature of reality.
Definition, but you still have an internal belief.
Same thing with Christians, by the way.
Religion.
As I understand, very, very early Christians, we're talking like before all of the Gospels were written. Because if I'm not mistaken, the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, was written like significantly after the other three. Maybe I'm mistaken, but at least in the first three, it seemed like Jesus's like divinity was through adoption by God, not by being birthed by he wasn't born divine, he was adopted through his actions, and early Christians believe that. It would be very different to have a person encountered from a Christian now, from who knows how many of different sects, right? Encounter a person then who believes something very, very different, but both pretty clearly Christian. Well, I guess some people will quibble about who's a Christian and who's not, but you get the point.
Conformed.
Yeah, but the problem is your definition of woman references a social construct and references society. Because if we say a woman is somebody whose internal perception aligns with
right, but he's referencing the social you would reference the social
that is
construct
in reference to
of the
a
culture
broader
from which
group of
you
people,
come,
which is the rest of the people you're geographically around, your society. So
Yes.
under that view, if we were to go to a different society, what your internal perception is would align a completely different way. It may align with masculine things. That would mean somebody can become woman or man depending on where in the world they're standing.
You mean if you
no.
take somebody as a baby
We've
and
covered
have them
this.
raised in an environment in which like the cultural views of femininity and masculinity are different, then yeah, like the way that they perceive themselves or are a woman or man, excuse me, based on their internal perception.
People in chat.
Yeah,
Oh my God, she's like 200 IQ.
different.
No, she's
There are
actually
different roles
very
and
much not.
expectations throughout
But this is, you know what? I do want to talk about this. This is why this comment right here. I hope you can see this. It's covered, but yeah, you can see it fine. This is why there need to be better responses to people like this, is because she comes off, and Dr. Bogardus is the same way, and other people are similar, as very, very intelligent because of the method by which they're arguing and their aptitude for like competitive debate style. But what she's saying is still nonsense. And it's ignoring like some very obvious thing. Like, it took me 2 seconds to find the problems here, right? And I don't think I'm 200 IQ. In fact, when I was much younger, I took IQ tests, and I'm very much not 200 IQ. But I mean, obviously, this is a hyperbole. But the point is, it comes off as more intelligent, and if you're not able to address it on its own terms, it doesn't necessarily you come off like it's not. It's just, it seems to a lot of people that just by presentation style that Saanvi is correct, and it sucks. It shouldn't be like that, but unfortunately, a lot of persuasion has nothing to do with argumentation. Yeah, and see, like, immediately after, Hunter's constant appeals to culture is just him contradicting his definition of what constitutes a woman, which is internal, not cultural. Except it isn't contradictory at all. He's just struggling to articulate what she's saying isn't a problem for his framework whatsoever, and she's ignoring crucial information, like crucial ways in which the world works, like that people don't drop their culture the moment they step outside of the like borders that surround its culture, right? Like if you're from America, the second you step into Canada, you don't leave your Americanness behind, or what you understand as gender roles based on your American upbringing. He's just like a little bit struggling to articulate that what she's talking about is nonsense.
History for women. This is why at one point an internal perception of yourself as being cultural views of femininity would probably include much more rigid roles as well, right? Like staying in the kitchen, for example. But this has changed. Yeah. And so we clearly recognize a social element of gender.
Yeah, and you can even ask her, like, are you less womanly than when, like, I mean, I guess she's taking the gender, she's taking the, like, the, oh, I'm blanking on the phrase I've been using for it. The biological essentialist model, which is not true. So, like, she wouldn't, but, like, clearly what we mean by woman has changed. Does that mean, like, people don't understand what womanhood is, even though it's changed? Like, no, obviously, the concept changes, and we adjust appropriately, and also our culture does inform what we think, even when we go somewhere else.
And so,
and this is why people, by the way,
who
were raised in that culture often insist that women should be back at home. There are people who try to lie all the time about like how women are less happy now that they've been working because they've been working or whatever. People do make arguments that women should be doing that because they're used to it. What happened? Why didn't their culture go away? Did he ask her, how do you know you're a woman? No, he didn't. And I've been saying he should have. It'd be very rude, but it would put to the test immediately the flaws with her alleged framework. I don't think she actually holds this framework. I think that would be a good idea. Yeah, I agree, Peachy Keen. That's what I've been saying for a while. Like, yeah, just come at her. Like, but she's also unwilling to defend her position because it's like, well, technically that's not what we're here to argue, and it wouldn't matter if I'm wrong. Except obviously it's being treated like the default, and if you don't prove your case, it's reasonable to use the biological essentialist model. There was a little while where Hunter was pressing her and doing so pretty effectively, and as I thought, he kind of he as he was very very close to making headway, he broke off and we're on something else now. But yeah, I think I think it would have been a very good idea to press her of like, how do you know you're a woman? Now she could lie, or maybe she has gotten genetic testing done on herself, or she could lie about it if she hasn't. But obviously, like you can start asking about like, okay, how do you know I'm a man, right? Like, but you're happy to treat me as one. Maybe that's not how your system works whatsoever. Yeah, I agree. I think it would have been a good idea.
Since my definition is the reference to the internal perception, it is more encompassing of all women, not just trans women, but of all women, and it serves more functionality as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't think this really like addresses the point though, because if what you like just mentioned, take being in the kitchen, being nurturing, qualities that maybe in America we typically associate with females, and your identity aligns more with those things like being submissive, being nurturing, being in the kitchen. If you travel to like a part of West Africa, those traits and beliefs and perceptions that you hold may make you a man because that is not what their society traditionally views as
Is that
typically
real?
associated.
That's pretty cool if that's true.
My definition of a woman is not just whatever society says.
It's somebody whose internal perception aligns with what society views as
with
female
the society from which they developed the understanding of womanhood. So remember, like you don't. Nobody goes to Africa and goes like, "Oh, I guess I'm wrong about what men and women should be like." Like according to like yeah, like by your understanding that someone should like go go to this culture where things are reversed and immediately start behaving opposite to that, to the way they had been prior. But obviously, that's not how things actually go.
It's their internal perception that aligns with what we culturally view as being feminine, not like in the moment. That internal perception is formed over time. That's why I say that gender identity is influenced. It's not like you're switching from man or woman because culturally they define it here, then culturally they define it there. This is why the internal perception holds the weight, which.
But you might, if you spend enough time in that culture where things are different, you might start to get really uncomfortable with how you were being treated on the assumption that you should behave differently than how you feel you ought to based on your gender or whatever. You like there might be a growing discomfort the more time you spent there and the more you were treated and you're differently, and the expectations on you were different to what you think how you think you ought to be.
Is going to take time and influence to form in regards to the external.
Yeah, I'm not denying that. So in the example like I posited, in America, you might be raised in a way that those are the traits we typically deemed to be feminine, which are to be nurturing, to be caring, to be submissive, stay in the kitchen, whatnot. Now, if you travel to another place, you still have those characteristics, like you mentioned. That's not something you can just sort of change, right? You're still going to
Your
gravitate
internal
towards that.
perception is still the same, yes.
Yeah, that you can't change that. That's still going to be the same. All those
Yeah, I don't think
preferences
he's
are still going
gonna.
to be the
I don't
same.
think he's gonna
But
realize
now with the second part of
the
your definition,
the defeater to
aligns with
this.
what we culturally view as
It's
feminine.
unfortunate, but
That is no
it's
longer
why we're
going to
watching this,
align
right?
with what they culturally view as feminine in some places. That is going
Yeah,
to align
that's
with what they culturally
exactly
view
what
as
I mean.
masculine.
See, again, like I'm looking at the chat now because I feel like this portion is kind of concluded. We're just like they just haven't realized it yet, but like exactly here, right? Like Sanvi has won this by Lantine. She's schooling him. Um, this perception because of presentation, is something that I think there needs to be a better response to, and I think I could do that.
That's possible. So I think that would imply that their gender would still change via geographic location.
No, it wouldn't, because gender is not just the external social construct, it's also the internal perception. So the internal perception forms on a basis of cultural views of femininity. This doesn't mean that cultural views of femininity determine whether or not you are a woman on a whim. It means that the way you form that internal identity is in regards to the external social construct. I feel like I feel like maybe we've hit a wall or something, because I feel like I'm saying the
We
same
have.
thing and then you're saying the same thing, that I'm saying the same thing. But like,
Well,
it's
yeah,
exactly the same.
Yeah,
So
I think
for
he has an
somebody who
understanding of the problem that I've been illustrating, but he hasn't articulated it particularly well. But I agree. Like it does feel like we've hit a bit of a wall, so that's why I'm not commenting too much.
longer a football fan in Brazil, if they like watching the NFL here in America, or if they like watching the NFL, right? And here in the US, and then they go to Brazil and they say, I'm a football fan, are they no longer a football fan?
The problem is being a football fan, liking American football, has like literally nothing to do with like your what you align with cultural perceptions, because
There's
you can like
cultural views of
football,
sports, culturally.
but you don't have to
Yes.
align with that to be a football fan.
Wait, no. The social external construct of sports, the foundational social construct, varies in society. But
Yes.
if you identify yourself as a football fan in regards to the external social construct being US NFL football teams,
Right.
and then you go to a society in which football is something different, are you no longer a football fan? This is really a yes or no question. Right?
Well, no, because I mean, obviously, I acknowledge that your internal preferences, they never change, right? What I was more so,
Well, that's not
obviously
true
you're
at
still
all.
gonna be a
But
football fan, your preferences don't change. What I was more so pushing back on was that second part, where it's that internal perception has to align with X for you to be a woman. With football, your internal perception of liking it doesn't have to align with anything. You just gotta like it to be a football fan. But with your definition of woman, it's an internal perception that aligns with what the culture views as.
I feel that sorry, I realize the problem. I think you're taking from my definition that I'm saying someone whose internal perception aligns with what we culturally view as being feminine constantly, like it must remain so. But what I'm saying is that the external social construct forms the internal identity. And that internal identity can still change and whatnot. But like I said, most people, by the time they're the age of like 5, 6, 7, 8, have a pretty decent understanding already of their gender identity.
okay, this is a pretty good attempt at explaining what he's trying to say. I don't think it's a little. I think some people are still going to struggle with it, and Sanvi might as well. But one moment, I have to just give me 1 second. Very sorry about that. I hate these spam phone calls, but like you never know when it's important. Uh, he done a reasonable attempt. It was a reasonable attempt at like expressing the thing. Basically, he's saying is exactly what I was getting at, which is that like the concept of what that means is cemented in your head, and then how much you like, it's like how much you, how much you jive with how much your internal perception of yourself jives with your sense of what society expects from of femininity or masculinity. But that internal sense of what society expects isn't like you don't throw it out moment to moment, as he was saying. You have that sense pretty young, and like that it might up while it might update, that is in your head. It doesn't go away the second you go to another society.
So it's not like a constant like you
In
must
what
keep
regard?
aligning
In regard
internally.
of what
You must
their
keep aligning.
preferences are?
I can give you a chance to respond to Sanvi's question, and then we got to go into the Q&A.
In
Yeah, we
regards to
can-
how they see themselves, in regards to probably preferences. I would be more than happy to look it up.
And
give
yeah,
you
I
more
don't think it would be a
specifics
problem
if
for him
you'd
to say like,
but,
yeah, maybe over time you would
yeah, it's
lose
not
that
like
perception of your original culture's idea of femininity, and over time you might start. If you were in a society where it was very different for long enough, you might start to be like, man, you know what? At a minimum, you might start to be like, you know what? I would prefer if people treated me as well. If you were a woman, you might say as a man, you know.
must keep internally aligning with this. You must keep internally aligning with this. It's more that like there is that external social construct, and yes, it's.
And I think we
going to
will watch
change
some of the
as society
Q&A
changes.
precisely to
But
see what I was
once
saying
that internal
in the
perception
chat.
is
I
more
expect
or
to
less
see more of it
formed,
in Q&A.
that's what holds the weight. That's why it stays constant. Just if society or a different culture has different views.
We're going to jump into the Q&A, but first, a couple of housekeeping type things. Folks, I have pinned at the top of the chat. Have you been to the Modern Day Debate Discord? If you haven't, check it out right now. That's pinned to the top of the chat, or if you're watching afterwards, you can find it in the description box. Check out the Modern Day Debate Discord. We'd love to have you a part of the conversation there as the debates keep going. We're going to jump into the Q&A. Want to say as well,
We'll watch a little bit of the Q&A,
our guests are linked in the
not tons
description.
of it,
Check
but
their links
I
out
expect
right now.
we'll
That includes if
see
you're listening via the
some amount
podcast.
of
And
some
Simon
amount of what I
Allen
was
says,
pointing out in the
"You
chat
should
here.
not be awake, but caught it live." Thanks for all the work you put into this, James. We salute you. Thanks for your kind words. And all credit to the speakers. They are the lifeblood of the channel. Check out their links. Sanvi, you don't have a link right now, do you?
Mm-mm.
Banned from TikTok. Very sad. But Simon Allen says Sanvi wins. You have a fan out there, Sanvi.
Yeah, see, there you go.
This
Yeah,
one from
exactly.
B Smiley the Third says, "Let's go, Sanvi. Let's go." You had a lot of cheerleaders. Steven
There was
says,
also a
"Otsumi
lot of
says, what is a
simping in the
woman?"
chat.
Sanvi is.
I didn't
What
point
is
it
a
out, but
goddess?
there's a lot.
Sanvi is. Wow.
Oh yeah, there it
Who
is.
my
There's some of it.
queen? Sanvi. Okay.
Yeah, there's a
Wow.
lot of that.
Zoom says. Your face. Okay. Von Zoom says, "Do either of you feel that trans women reinforce feminine gender stereotypes?"
Well, I was hoping this would come up.
Oh, you were? Okay.
Because
What
this
you
is
got?
definitely a perceived hypocrisy, and I totally understand why. The thing is that
Oh, by the way, this is also a bit of a trap that a lot of trans people fall into. Is like if they behave like stereotypically feminine, they'll be accused of like of like parroting womanhood and like just reinforcing gender stereotypes and yada yada etc. But if they express insufficiently feminine, then they're saying, oh, like you're not like you don't actually want to be a woman in any way. You're just a faker, yada yada etc. It's often just a trap. Oftentimes, at the very least, I've heard ContraPoints say that the outward expression that might be more stereotypical is to engender the kinds of treatment that she wants. She's trying to, foghorn blast, hey, treat me like a woman to get that to be treated as such. And if she could, if you could, I assume if she could do so with, without as much stereotypical feminine behavior. I mean, I don't know how she acts in her day to day. It might not be that much of it, but like she seems to say that there is that expectation. That expectation is why she might behave that way, so that she gets the kind of treatment that she's looking to get of being treated as a woman. But of course, it shouldn't be a requisite for that. You should, it shouldn't be that hard to come by.
gender, well, first of all, this is built on a faulty assumption that like all trans people are simultaneously gender abolitionists. There's a good chunk of trans people who just don't
Are
care
gender
about
essentialist, yeah.
well, gender means a lot to them because of the way they've either struggled with it or like the way that they've just interacted with it, their upbringing, whatnot. So like not every trans person is a gender abolitionist, is the first thing. The second thing is, even if the long-term goal were to abolish gender entirely, come on, it's ridiculous to be like, oh, now trans people, you just wait it out and just die by the time we actually get around to like.
He seems to be answering a slightly different question if it's confusing to you why he's saying what he's saying. Basically, he's taking from the question the implication that like, well, shouldn't like don't you want to like break down gender norms and yada yada, etc. Well, it's like, well, not all trans people necessarily want to get rid of gender as a concept, but even still, there's also that like turf position of like, well, shouldn't you want to be getting rid of gender? So like why are you trying to transition to like these gender roles? Well, obviously in the meantime people are suffering. In the meantime, trans people exist, and their their sense of self is something that like can be their sense of self in contrast with the way they're treated is can cause a lot of discomfort and a lot of pain. So in the meantime, isn't it really good to reduce the amount of pain in the world and the amount of suffering? Yeah, I'd say so. And that's a practical reason for why you should treat trans people as the gender with which they identify, even if everything Saanvi said was true, and it's not. There are practical reasons why they should be treated as their gender, even if you don't buy into the reasons why they are in fact their gender, which I think they are, and I think there are as good of reasons for anything for anyone being a given gender. There are good reasons for trans people being their gender.
Deconstructing this thing, I'm of the opinion that gender is never going to not exist. I think that gender is always going to exist, so long as
I'm less
humans
certain,
interact
but
with each
maybe.
other. I think that
hard
really
to
what
say.
we need to be getting rid of is the expectations. So if you have a trans person who wants to externally present themselves in ways that might be like feminine, culturally viewed as being feminine right now, right, like wearing a dress or whatnot, there's nothing wrong with that, because right now that's gendered. That's what people see it as. But if you're coming up and saying, now I identify as a woman, so I'm going to act ditzy or something, well, now you're talking about actually upholding like a bad and harmful expectation or stereotype. So it's not really the same thing.
This is from B. Smiley the Third. It says, "Get him, Saanvi." This one from the Trib One says, "Hi, James. In the day today, I think this is for you guys though. They say, in the day today, men and women will be quote unquote misgendered regularly. Does it matter? Probably depends on the level of misgendering, right?" Then says, "For both, when does being misgendered matter? Is it when the individual being misgendered knows?"
This question's a little off topic, but it does shine a light on the practical reality of like this isn't just an esoteric philosophical concept we're talking about. This affects people's lives, and like to what extent, and the practicality of how we approach things. Like clearly the biological essentialist model is not practical in any regard. Nobody's DNA testing the people they meet before they decide what pronouns to use, right? Whereas at least with hunters, it's a lot more accessible and a lot more practical to just be like, oh yeah, like what are your pronouns? Yeah, like that's really easy.
Outside of sports, sex, and medicine, does sex matter societally?
I think maybe that one might be for me.
Well, it was explicitly
I
for
don't
both
know,
of you.
but does misgendering somebody matter? Does sex matter outside of sports, medicine, and what was the other one?
And medicine, sports, and sex.
Oh, okay, so just medicine, sports. Okay.
Oh,
I
bye,
don't really know
Hunter.
how to answer that. I think the whole thing with misgendering,
Hunter
I
left.
don't
Should we
think
leave
the
too?
average non-trans person
Oh, he's
gets
back. He's back.
super harmed by misgendering them. I think they simply correct and move on. I don't think it's something they dwell on. I don't.
Well, you say that, but like, it depends on the extent, right? If nobody ever correctly genders you, that's a pretty significant psychological impact on your life. I imagine you would feel very discomforted if everyone referred to you as he, him, Sadvi, like your whole life. That would be probably kind of a pain for you. In addition to all of that, it's not merely that you can correct them and they'll move on. A lot of people will not move on, and make PowerPoints about why you're wrong to ask for to be gendered, you know, it's like to be treated as your gender. Uh, in addition to like, you know, gatekeeping in different parts of society, it is not merely like, oh my bad, like no like the people who are like foaming at the mouth about how trans people are coming for your kids aren't going to be like, listen man, and they're just like, oh actually I prefer she her, oh my bad, yeah I'm just gonna she her, and like, oh my bad miss, I didn't mean to do. That does not happen. That is not how the world is. Like, it makes you wonder if this, like, if she's ever encountered a human being.
I don't think it's something that leads to suicidality or self-harm or anything like that. But that doesn't seem to be the case for transgender individuals. They seem to take gender to be a very serious part of their identity. Likely.
See, there's a little bit of like, you do too. You just don't realize it, Sanvi. Like we all do in ways that we don't really think about. The easy example is what I just said. If everyone in your life used he him pronouns for you, you would start to like, gender would be a lot more on your mind. There's just like a little bit of this privilege that, like, it's okay to acknowledge that when your gender aligns cleanly with what you were assigned and you're correctly gendered and people treat you in that way, like, you just don't have to think about it that much. You know, it's yeah, it's kind of the same way that like atheists think a lot more about religion than a lot of religious people. It's just because, like, well, you live in a society where like it's kind of maligned, not nearly to the same degree, to be clear, not nearly to the same extent, but it's a thing that like comes up a lot more. It's the same thing with like why black people will often have more thoughts about race in general, because it comes up for them a lot more frequently. Any marginalized group is going to have this come up, and so yeah, it's like a little bit weird to be like, well, it's, you know, the implication is like, well, they think a lot. It seems really important to them for some reason. Well, because it's not something that can be that society allows you to like quickly move along from. If trans people could just be like, oh, I'm just gonna like change my gender and present differently, and nobody like gave a hassle about it, and it were like something easy, then it probably wouldn't make much difference in their lives either.
Due to things like gender dysphoria, whatnot. I do not think that there would be a harm present if you didn't do it in the presence of somebody. I can't think of a way, at least, because the harm of misgendering seems to be that somebody felt their identity was violated interpersonally.
Well, it's a
But
rudeness, right? Like, obviously, rudeness can be a harm. If I were to like refer to you like, if someone refers to someone else as a slur, right? Like, then that's pretty harmful. But like, what's the harm? Well, it's rudeness and it's feeling unsafe and so on and so forth. Clearly, there are harms that we can that are a lot more like emotional in nature. It doesn't mean like, it's not like if you misgender someone, a bone will break, obviously, but there are harms beyond that.
I wouldn't see how that would be a harm done behind somebody's back.
I mean, you say that, but like, again, like, just for real, if everyone in your life misgendered you, you'd start to find it pretty harmful.
I agree. By the way, I don't know how it would be harmful. It's more of like a respect thing. Just like if I
Well,
know
it's a
that
harm in
somebody's a
like to
Christian,
disrespect, right? Like,
I'm not harming them if behind their back I say, fuck God or something. But because I respect them, I'm not going to purposely disrespect, how.
yeah, and that's a good example from Hunter of like, yeah, there's some people who get real mad, like, especially if they're real big on the Ten Commandments. Where, remember, one of them is not to take the name of take God's name in vain. If you start saying, Jesus Christ, God damn it, like, people will get real mad about it. And what's the harm there? Well, the harm is to decorum. It's rudeness. Now, obviously, you don't have like a total right to not be offended or whatever, but it is it is nice when people aren't rude to each other. I think that's kind of cool, actually. And if it's so ubiquitous as with the misgendering, and it's such a cause for discomfort. I mean, this is why the suicide rate for trans people is so high. There was a study where it's something like the suicide rate drops by like 16/17 if there's one family member who's supportive of the trans person and their identity and all that. Like, clearly there are psychological impacts. I'm surprised Hunter's like, yeah, it's not harmful.
How they identify or believe.
Not in a physical way, I guess,
You
but
got
there
it.
are
This one
additional
coming in
harms.
from. Do appreciate it as well.
All right, we'll see if this
Gabriel
question's
Alliance is
good.
proof
Otherwise,
that
we'll move on.
Man can be woman. I don't know what they mean by that. It says James.
Yeah, it's a
check
terrible
your
question.
email. I checked it. I didn't see anything, Gabriel. Let me know. Con the Stoner says, are adoptive parents parents? If so, why would you say trans women aren't women? And if
It's
not,
it's an Oakwood question, but it's really easy to get around because like the definition of parent um, doesn't necessitate parentage. Now we do a lot of definition searching here. So like, well, okay, this is not helpful. A mother or father, to act, to be or act as a parent to a child. Okay, well, look, hey Sanvi, you want to get mad about this one? The word parent is in the name, but it means to act as this thing. But like, okay, what is mother, a woman in relation to child or children? Uh, yeah, it's wow, it's actually kind of hard to find a workable definition. A woman in relation to, what do you mean in relation to? In relation to. Yeah, it's really hard to define because there's not that clarity. Well, a lot of definitions are like, oh, the person who like was like because obviously there's an association of biological parentage with being a parent, but we acknowledge that being an adoptive parent is still a legitimate way. It's kind of in the same. The implication here is that being a trans woman is kind of like being an adoptive parent, right? You're an adoptive woman. You have adopted that role, and you act in that role, and it would be pretty fucked up to argue that you are not in fact that role, right? Like imagine arguing with an adoptive parent that they're not actually a parent. The difficulty is it's the adoptive parent, being an adoptive parent is so long-standing and understood that we've made the caveat in the definition of parent to include adoptive parents. I mean, it doesn't exist here, but like we've seen it elsewhere. I don't want to break out my dictionary. It's a reasonable. The implication is correct. The only difference is that we accept adoptive parents, and we are currently working on the acceptance of adoptive women as the
doesn't it sound rude
corollary.
to tell a child caretaker that they are not?
Yeah.
Because like by your
The
view,
simple-
Sanvi, to be clear, by your view, Sanvi, you would have to say, well, you're not the biological parentage. Like I could be like if you want to like devil's advocate in this position, Hunter could say something to the effect of like oh, isn't a parent is defined as someone who gave birth or who sired an offspring, who sired or gave birth to an offspring. You're trying like, and that's how we've always used it, and that's the normal view. Aren't you trying like, and yours doesn't work and yada, but like clearly we have that understanding that adoptive parents are parents.
Well, answer to that is I think the definition of a parent, the definition of a father and a mother, isn't necessarily biological. I think it
Neither is neither is gender, but you insist it is. Okay, whatever.
can also be legal.
Oh,
right?
that was so silly. If you saw me reach, I thought I saw like something on my screen. I was trying to like scratch it off. It was just there was something on Sanfi's
Like you
screen.
can
Oh,
have
that's very silly.
legal custodial guardianship over somebody, and you would be exhibiting motherhood, fatherhood, parenthood. So, a trans woman is not a woman because they don't fit that category. A adoptive mother is
You could
still
make this exact argument with with being a parent. The only difference is that we are already on board for adoptive parents being legitimate parents.
mother because they do fit that.
You got it. This one. From
Okay, I'm gonna stop it here. I think we got the sense of like why I don't go through Q&A too much, and what we can expect here. We got a couple nuggets, and we did see exactly what I was talking about of like the chat being like way on board with Sanvi, even though her arguments don't actually work. Part of the problem is just that Hunter was struggling to articulate his position, which I think he did demonstrate like I do think that he made his case very well, even though I don't really agree with his definition. I think he argued from that position extremely well, and he was certainly way more correct than Sanvi. The only difference was he was having trouble finding the flaws in what she was saying and articulating the issues. And this is why I wanted to come back to this and why I want to go over debates like this. And what I think I could contribute to this kind of space is that I'm not the only one, obviously, but I do know how to deal with this kind of stuff, how to respond to these things, and where the flaws are. And I hope I've made it clear just how bad her arguments were, even though they come across as very like philosophical and academic and like clearly she knows what she's talking about. I mean, we even looked up the SRY gene thing of like, oh, that sounded really smart until you look into it all and then you find out that it's incredibly dishonest and also basically just genitalia but with extra steps. So I hope that was helpful for everyone. I'm glad we split it up into 2 days. That was a lot more accessible. It was tough finding a break point, but between the 2 days, this took over 4.5 hours, closer to like 5, which I guess I could do all at once, but without, as of right now, I don't have enough of a chat to really be energized enough to go that long. So for the moment, I'm glad we split it up. Let me know either chat or comments wherever if you like going over stuff longer debates, just breaking it up over several days. If we have to, we can go to 3. Let me know if that's something that works for you, if you find it interesting. I do prefer to go in depth through do in-depth shadow boxing, as it were. Really get into this. I even went less in depth than I could have with some of the like SRY stuff. We did very little googling and researching, as you noticed, though that's also in part because there wasn't a whole lot that would necessitate it. But yeah, if it's something that you like, let me know. If you'd prefer that we keep it to 1 day, let me know that too. I see you, Peachy Keen, saying you don't mind it. I appreciate it. I guess I can point here now. You're like right there, something like that. God, I have to do something about how this looks. If someone wants to like, I've always hated doing CSS. If someone wants to like shoot me some CSS to like make this look nice, oh, I would very much appreciate it. I could do it myself probably, but I hate CSS and like trying to figure out how best to make it work. But that all being said, thanks so much everyone for watching. Have a happy 4th of July. I didn't change it in my schedule yet, but I think I might dial my stream back to 4 days a week. I think we might do Monday through Thursday. We'll see. We'll still go through. Still do the full 5, but it has been kind of a lot to do the full 5. So we'll see. I'm still thinking about it. Let me know what you think. Be sure, if you'd be so kind, if you'd grace me such, to like, comment, subscribe, tell your friends. Much appreciated. But that's all I got for you today. So thanks so much for watching. Have a good one. I'm out. I'll catch you later. Bye.